Section 1. The Setup. There is a moment that happens to almost everyone who has watched The Simpsons long enough. You are scrolling through your phone, or reading a headline, or watching something unfold on the news, and a scene from the show floats up from the back of your memory, something you watched years ago, maybe decades ago, and you realize with a slow, creeping discomfort that the show already did this. It already covered this exact thing. It depicted it, joked about it, built an entire episode around the premise of it, and then the world caught up and made it real. The Simpsons has been on the air since December 17th, 1989, 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, more than 8,000 individual jokes, observations, satires, and throwaway gags about American life, technology, politics, culture, science, and human nature. It is the longest-running American animated series in history, the longest-running American sitcom, the longest-running scripted primetime series ever made. And somewhere inside all of those episodes, buried inside all of those thousands of hours of television, there are moments that seem to reach forward through time and touch the present in ways that feel like they should not be possible. Some of those moments are obvious. You have seen the screenshots. You have seen the memes. The Trump escalator. The tablet computer that looks like an iPad. The three-eyed fish in a contaminated river. The pandemic that starts in Asia and spreads globally while the town panic buys and searches desperately for a cure. The corporate merger that seemed impossible until it happened. These are the famous ones. The ones that get shared and reshared every time the world lurches in a direction Springfield apparently already mapped. But there are others. Quieter ones. More specific ones. Moments where the show was not just gesturing at a general trend, but pointing at something precise, a technology, a social dynamic, a scientific discovery, a political development with a specificity that makes the coincidence harder to wave away. And then there are the ones that feel genuinely unsettling in a way that the famous examples do not, because the famous examples are well known enough that they have been absorbed into the culture and processed and explained and filed away. The unsettling ones are the ones that have not been fully reckoned with yet. Tonight we are going to go through all of them. Every prediction, every coincidence, every moment where a show about a yellow cartoon family in a fictional American town seemed to know something about the future that the future had not gotten around to revealing yet. We are going to rank them from the least surprising to the most inexplicable, from the ones that make you nod and say, yes, that makes sense, to the ones that make you set down whatever you are holding and just stare at the wall for a moment. The ranking is built around a single question. How insane is it that this happened? Some of these are easy to explain. The writers were smart, educated people who read widely and thought carefully about where technology and culture were heading, and they made reasonable extrapolations that turned out to be correct. That is not prophecy. That is intelligence. But some of them are harder to explain that way. Some of them are specific in ways that intelligence alone does not fully account for. Some of them are strange in ways that resist the comfortable debunking. We are going to start slow and easy and let the strangeness build gradually. By the time we reach the top of the list, you will have a different relationship with this show than you have right now. Not because The Simpsons is magic, not because the writers are time travelers or prophets or connected to something that cannot be named, but because spending time with 50 of these moments in sequence does something to your sense of what coincidence means and how much of the world around you was already drawn in rough outline somewhere inside 800 episodes of a cartoon sitcom. The method for ranking is this. Each prediction is evaluated on three things: how specific the prediction was, how unlikely the outcome seemed at the time the episode aired, and how completely the real-world event matched what the show depicted. A vague gesture at a general trend scores low. A precise, detailed, accurate depiction of something that would not happen for years or decades scores high. And the ones that are both precise and inexplicable, the ones where you cannot fully account for how the writers got so close to a specific truth, those are the ones at the top. So, let us go to Springfield. Let us start at the bottom of the list and climb. The lights are low. The night is quiet. Settle in. Before we get into the rankings, take a moment if you would like. Drop a comment with where you are right now and what time it is wherever you are in the world. There is something about knowing that someone in a completely different place is also lying in the dark, listening to a show about a cartoon family that seems strangely comforting. And if you want to hear more of these, subscribe. There is more coming, and the algorithm, much like the Springfield nuclear power plant, runs better when people are paying attention. Section 2. The warm-ups predictions, 50 through 41. Number 50. Self-checkout machines. We begin somewhere familiar. In a 1996 episode, a Springfield grocery store features a checkout lane that operates without a human cashier. The customers scan their own items. The machine takes their money. The whole interaction is automated and impersonal and slightly confusing for everyone involved. The joke, such as it is that this is a reasonable extrapolation of where retail was going. Remove the human. Speed up the transaction. Make the customer do the work and call it convenience. Self-checkout machines were not common in American stores in 1996. They existed in limited pilot form in a handful of locations, but they were not part of daily life. The idea of walking into a grocery store and checking yourself out without a cashier was, for most Americans at that time, a novelty at best. Most people had never done it. By the early 2000s, it was normalized. By the 2010s, it was dominant. By the time the pandemic arrived and retailers had every incentive to reduce human contact at point of sale, self-checkout became so prevalent that several major chains began eliminating staffed lanes almost entirely in certain locations. The machines took the jobs. The customers did the labor. The corporate margin improved, exactly as the joke suggested it would. This one ranks at 50 because it requires the least amount of explanation. The trend was already visible. Technology was already moving in this direction. A smart writer in 1996, looking at where retail automation was heading, would reasonably land on self-checkout as a near-future certainty. It is not a prediction so much as an early observation. It belongs on the list because it was right, but it is not surprising that it was right. Number 49. Robotic lawnmowers. Also from the mid-90s, the show depicts a small autonomous device rolling around a suburban lawn, cutting the grass without human guidance. A robot mower, a little machine that navigates a yard on its own, turns when it reaches the edge, and keeps going until the job is done. The Roomba, which became the cultural reference point for autonomous home appliances, did not arrive until 2002. The first commercially available robotic lawnmowers arrived around the same time, though they were expensive and limited and not yet part of mainstream suburban life. For a mid-90s viewer, the image of a little robot trundling around your yard doing your chores was futuristic enough to read as a joke rather than a forecast. Now they are sold at hardware stores. They are advertised during football games. The concept that seemed faintly absurd in the 90s is now a product category with dozens of competing brands at multiple price points. The joke grew up and became a Saturday errand eliminated. Number 49. Because again the trend was visible. Robotic home automation was a conversation that was happening in technology circles in the 90s, and the leap from industrial automation to domestic automation was not a difficult one to imagine. The show imagined it early and accurately, but not inexplicably so. Number 48. Smart glasses. In a 1995 episode, a character wears a pair of glasses that appear to be doing something beyond simply correcting vision. The frames seem to contain a small display. The implication is that the glasses themselves are computing something, overlaying information on the world the wearer sees. Google Glass arrived in 2013, 18 years later. It failed commercially and became something of a cultural cautionary tale about technology that arrives before the social context that would make it acceptable. But it existed. The concept was real, and the show had sketched the rough outline of it nearly 2 decades before the engineers in Mountain View built the actual hardware. The reason this sits at 48 rather than somewhere higher is that science fiction had been depicting heads-up display technology for decades before The Simpsons put it in a gag. The concept was not original to the show. What the show did was translate a science fiction trope into a consumer product in a way that turned out to be directionally accurate. They said, "This will be glasses you wear casually, not a helmet or a visor." That specificity is worth noting, even if the broader concept was already in the cultural air. Number 47. Video calling as a daily habit. The show depicted video phone calls on multiple occasions across the 90s and early 2000s. Characters would pick up a device that was essentially a telephone but with a screen, and the person on the other end would appear visually, and they would have a normal conversation while looking at each other. This is almost too obvious to rank. Video calling had been theorized and depicted in science fiction since at least the 1960s, when AT&T showcased a picture phone prototype at the World's Fair. The technology existed in rudimentary form for decades before it became practical. What The Simpsons contributed was depicting it as completely unremarkable, as ordinary as a phone call, something you do while distracted, something that is just part of life rather than a technological marvel. That normalization is the prediction. Not the technology itself, which everyone knew was coming, but the cultural texture of it. The way a video call in the show was just a call. Nobody was impressed by it. Nobody commented on the remarkable fact that they were speaking to a moving image of another person. It was just Tuesday. That nonchalance, that cultural absorption of what was then still remarkable technology, is what the show got right. And now here we are in a world where children find it slightly strange that their grandparents' generation once thought video calling was science fiction. Number 46. Autocorrect embarrassment. In a 1994 episode, an early Apple Newton device, a real product that existed and was notorious for its unreliable handwriting recognition, misreads input and produces nonsensical output. The joke involves the device translating a simple, written message into something absurd and wrong in a way that the user does not catch before the message is sent. This is a 1994 joke about a 1993 product, so in terms of predicting the future, the timeline is tight. What the show was really doing was observing a present-tense technology failure and making a joke about it. The prediction embedded in the joke is this: that this kind of error machine misreading human intent and producing embarrassing nonsense would not go away as technology improved. It would persist and migrate to new platforms. The Newton failed, but its ghost lived on in every smartphone autocorrect failure that followed, in every text message that arrived at the wrong meaning, in every email that was embarrassingly corrected by an algorithm that was confident but wrong. The show did not predict autocorrect specifically. It predicted that the fundamental problem machines confidently misunderstanding humans would be a recurring feature of our relationship with technology rather than a bug that would be fixed. That is a more interesting observation than it first appears. Number 45. Smartwatches as status objects. A 1995 episode depicts a wristwatch that does more than tell time. It communicates, it displays information, it functions as a small wrist-mounted computer. And the character wearing it treats it as a status object, something that signals belonging to a certain class of person, a certain moment in technological adoption. The Apple Watch launched in 2015. The debate around it was almost entirely about whether it was a meaningful piece of technology or primarily a status object for people who wanted to signal their relationship with Apple and what that relationship meant about their taste, and their income and their values. The show had depicted exactly that social dynamic 2 decades earlier. The function mattered less than what owning the function said about you. That is a cultural observation more than a technological one, and cultural observations of that kind tend to have longer shelf lives than technical specifications. Number 44. The death of physical media. Across multiple episodes in the late 90s and early 2000s, the show depicted scenarios involving media that exists without physical form, music that lives in a device rather than on a disc, entertainment that is delivered rather than purchased and held. The specific formats change depending on the episode, but the underlying direction is consistent. Physical media is inconvenient. The future is content that flows to you rather than objects you accumulate. This was not an outlandish prediction in the early 2000s. The music industry was already watching digital downloads hollow out CD sales. But the completeness of what happened, the near total collapse of the physical media market for music, then for video, then for games, with streaming replacing ownership as the dominant model, would have seemed extreme, even to people who believed the trend was real. The show kept gesturing at a future where the thing was not the point, the access was the point. That future arrived more completely than most people in the 90s would have believed. Number 43. Noise-canceling headphones. A throwaway gag in a late 90s episode involves a character putting on headphones and becoming entirely sealed off from the noise of the world around them. The comedic point is the absoluteness of the isolation. The character cannot hear anything, cannot be reached, is functionally removed from the environment. Other characters shout. The headphone wearer is unreachable. Bose released the Quiet Comfort, the consumer product that made noise-canceling headphones a mainstream category, in 2003. They are now among the most common consumer electronics purchases globally. The particular social dynamic depicted in the episode, the deliberate acoustic isolation of a person in a shared space, the slight social contract violation of making yourself unhearable in a public or semi-public environment, is now one of the defining features of how people move through cities, offices, and airplanes. You can be in a room full of people and not be present in that room. The headphones make you functionally elsewhere. The show depicted this specific isolation as a comedic extreme. It is now Tuesday. Number 42, The Psychology of Online Shopping. In a 2000 episode, a character shops from home using a computer, making purchases without physically going to a store, and the depiction captures something specific about the psychology of the experience. The ease of it. The slight unreality of spending money through a screen, where the transaction lacks the physical weight of handing over cash or even swiping a card in person. The purchases arrive. More purchases follow. The convenience removes the friction that would otherwise regulate the spending. Amazon was already real in 2000. Online shopping was already possible. The prediction here is again not the technology but the psychology, the observation that frictionless purchasing would generate more purchasing, that making it easier to spend money without the social and physical rituals of going to a store would change not just how people shopped, but how they related to money and accumulation. The show caught the behavioral implication before behavioral economists had fully mapped it. Number 41. The Gig Economy's Fundamental Bargain. Across several episodes involving Homer taking on short-term, task-based work for various employers driving, delivering, performing services on demand, the show depicts a labor arrangement that resembles what would eventually be called the gig economy. The worker is technically independent. They set their own hours, they use their own equipment, they bear their own risk, and they make, when you calculate it honestly, somewhat less money than the arrangement initially appears to offer because the costs of independence are hidden inside the freedom. This is not a prediction of Uber or DoorDash specifically. The show did not know those companies were coming. What it predicted was the labor relationship, the rebranding of precarious employment as flexibility, the way that independence without security would be packaged and sold as a lifestyle choice rather than an economic arrangement, and the gap between what the arrangement advertised and what it actually delivered to the people doing the work. The gig economy did not fully arrive until the 2010s. The show was describing it in rough outline in the late 90s and early 2000s, which places it somewhere between observation and prediction. Section 3. Technology Predictions 40 through 31. Number 40. Tablets and the Death of Print Journalism. In a 2000 episode, Homer is depicted reading news on a flat electronic device, something that looks, in retrospect, unmistakably like a tablet computer. The newspaper beside him goes unread. The print edition is present but ignored, made redundant by the screen that delivers the same information more conveniently, with more interactivity, with less physical mess. This is one of the more cited examples, and it belongs in the technology section rather than higher on the list, because it is specific enough to be interesting, but general enough that the direction was already clear to anyone paying attention. Print journalism was already in a slow structural crisis by 2000. The internet was already drawing readers away from physical newspapers. A tablet that delivered news seemed like a natural next step. What makes it worth dwelling on for a moment is the detail of the physical newspaper sitting beside the electronic device, unread. The show was not saying print is dead in a dramatic way. It was depicting something more mundane and more accurate. That print would not be killed by a single decisive blow, but by a billion small moments of preference, where the screen was slightly easier and the paper sat slightly untouched, and this would accumulate over decades into an industry that had been hollowed out so gradually that by the time the full extent of the collapse was visible, most of the decisions that caused it were already years or decades in the past. Number 39. Deepfakes and the Reliability of Recorded Evidence. In a 1995 episode, video footage is depicted being manipulated to show something that did not happen, to make a recording appear to document an event that the recording is actually fabricating. The manipulation is discovered, but the episode raises the question implicitly: if recorded evidence can be manufactured, what does recorded evidence prove? Deepfake technology did not arrive in its current form until around 2017, when advances in machine learning made it possible to create convincing video of people saying and doing things they never said or did. The cultural and legal implications of that technology, the damage it does to the idea that seeing is believing, the way it poisons the evidential value of video recordings, the specific harm it inflicts on political discourse and individual reputation, have been a major ongoing crisis since then. The show in 1995 was not depicting the specific technology of machine learning-generated fakes. It was depicting the conceptual reality that recorded media had always been manipulable, that the authority people granted to video as evidence was contingent on a trust that could be and would be undermined. The technology has changed. The conceptual problem the episode identified has not. Number 38. Smart Homes and the Absurdity of Ambient Control. An episode from around the turn of the millennium depicts a fully automated smart home, a house that responds to voice commands, that adjusts its own temperature and lighting and appliances based on input from its inhabitants. The joke is about what happens when the home misunderstands, or when the systems malfunction, or when the gap between the promised convenience and the actual experience becomes a source of daily frustration rather than ease. Smart home technology is now widely available and widely adopted. And the specific comedic dynamic the show depicted: the voice command that triggers the wrong thing, the frustration of a system that is simultaneously impressive and unreliable. The particular absurdity of arguing with your own house is now a recognized feature of the experience that smart home manufacturers include in their own marketing as self-aware humor. The show made fun of smart homes before they existed widely enough to be made fun of, and the things it made fun of are exactly the things that people who own smart home devices now make fun of themselves. Number 37. Fame without demonstrated talent. Across multiple episodes, the show depicts characters achieving celebrity status through media exposure rather than through any demonstrated skill or achievement. The celebrity exists because the camera pointed at them and the audience responded to the pointing. The fame is the product. The question of whether the famous person has earned their fame through excellence at something is treated as beside the point. This is the influencer economy, not the specific mechanism of it. Social media platforms with algorithmic amplification did not exist when these episodes aired, but the underlying logic. That attention was a resource that could be accumulated and converted into money and status, without the mediating step of excellence at a craft. That you could become famous for being a person who had become famous for being a person, in a loop that generated its own momentum. The show depicted this as satire, as a critique of what celebrity culture was becoming. It turned out to be a description of what celebrity culture would entirely normalize within 2 decades. The critique became a category. Number 36. 24-hour news cycle and the manufacturing of urgency. The show across its run has depicted a local news ecosystem that is constantly in a state of crisis, where every story is the most important story, where the urgency of presentation is disconnected from the actual significance of what is being reported, where the format demands drama even when the content does not supply it. The anchors are performing alarm. The graphics are designed to trigger vigilance. The viewer is told that whatever is happening right now is what they must be paying attention to right now, and that tomorrow there will be something else that is equally urgent. This is an accurate description of 24-hour cable news, which had existed in limited form since CNN's launch in 1980, but which expanded and normalized and became the dominant media experience for millions of Americans across the 90s and 2000s. The show was satirizing a trend that was already underway, but the satire turned out to be more accurate than satire usually is, because the thing being satirized did not course correct. It escalated. The show kept depicting it, and the reality kept escalating, and now the satirical version and the actual version are difficult to distinguish. Number 35. Holographic performances. In a 1990s episode, a deceased performer appears to perform at a concert through what is essentially a holographic or video projection reproduction of their likeness. The audience watches a dead person perform. The performance is convincing enough to produce an emotional response. The lines between the real performance and the reproduced one are discussed and debated within the episode. Tupac Shakur's holographic appearance at Coachella in 2012 became a cultural flashpoint, and since then, holographic or high-definition projection performances of deceased artists, Michael Jackson, Roy Orbison, Whitney Houston, have been produced with varying degrees of commercial and critical success. The technology exists and is being used. The ethical and emotional questions the show raised: what is owed to the memory of a dead performer? Whether a reproduction of their likeness can stand in for the real experience? Who owns the right to deploy that likeness commercially? Are now real questions being negotiated in entertainment law and public discourse. Number 34. The obesity epidemic. Across multiple episodes and across decades of the show's run, characters in Springfield are depicted as increasingly large. The food environment they inhabit, the quick E-Mart, the fast food, the portion sizes, the quality of what is available and affordable has a cumulative effect on bodies. The show does not always frame this as tragedy or crisis. It is part of the texture of life in Springfield, the way the environment shapes the people inside it. The American obesity epidemic is real, well-documented, and ongoing. The show was not predicting a new phenomenon. It was depicting a trend that was already underway in American society. What it captured with some accuracy is the environmental dimension, that this was not primarily about individual choices, but about what choices were available, what was affordable, what was marketed, what was accessible. The food environment in Springfield is not healthy. The people in it eat what is there. The show frames this as normal rather than as aberrant, which is a more honest depiction of how environmental health conditions actually work than most health-conscious media of the era managed. Number 33. Esports as a legitimate competitive category. In a late 90s episode, competitive video gaming is depicted as an event people attend to watch, with an audience and stakes and the social trappings of a sporting event. The participants are treated as competitors. Their skill at the game is treated as a real skill deserving of the recognition that accompanies competitive achievement. Esports generated approximately $1.5 billion in revenue globally in 2023. Major professional leagues exist for multiple games. Teams have coaches and scouts and training regimens. Universities offer esports scholarships. The Olympics has discussed inclusion. When The Simpsons depicted this in the late 90s, competitive gaming as a spectator event was a fringe activity. The show played it partly for comedy. The audience at the time found the premise amusing. The premise is now an industry. Number 32. The hollowing of the middle class. This one runs across the entire series in a way that is less prediction than documentation. But the documentation has proven so accurate across 4 decades that it earns its place. Homer Simpson is a semi-skilled worker at a unionized job who owns a home in a decent neighborhood, takes family vacations, supports 3 children, and manages to maintain what his era understood as a middle-class lifestyle. In 1989, that was recognizable as plausible, uncomfortable, sometimes stretched, but plausible. The union job at a manufacturing or power generation facility was a real pathway to homeownership and a family wage. Over the 4 decades since the show began, that pathway has been progressively and systematically eliminated. The purchasing power of wages like Homer's has declined relative to housing costs, healthcare, education, and basic goods. The union density that made his job possible has collapsed in the private sector. The lifestyle the show depicted as normal for a working-class family has become, in many regions of America, accessible only to households with dual professional incomes. The show has continued to depict Homer's family as middle-class throughout. The show has continued to have Homer work the same job, live in the same house, take vacations, celebrate holidays, afford food and beer and emergencies. The gap between what the show depicts and what Homer's actual income would permit in the real America of 2025 has grown into a kind of commentary by itself. The show's static timeline, which preserves Homer's lifestyle in amber, has become an inadvertent document of what was lost. Number 31. The algorithm as cultural curator. An episode involving Homer's television viewing habits depicts a scenario where the technology providing his entertainment begins to learn his preferences and serve him more of what it has determined he likes, narrowing the range of what he encounters and reinforcing his existing tastes rather than expanding them. The joke is that Homer is delighted by this. He is pleased that the machine knows him. The implication that this knowing is also a kind of limiting does not register for him. This is the recommendation algorithm. Netflix, YouTube, Spotify, TikTok. Every major entertainment platform is now built around the same basic principle. Learn what the user has engaged with and serve them more of it. The cultural consequence, which was debated in technology and media circles for years before it became visible in political polarization, social fragmentation, and the collapse of shared cultural reference points, is exactly what the episode gestured at. You get more of what you already want. The machine is very good at giving you more of what you already want. Whether what you already want is the same thing as what would be good for you, or for the people around you, or for the society you inhabit, is a question the algorithm is not designed to ask. The show depicted Homer's joy at the narrowing and left the critique implicit. That is the right call. The explicit critique would have been preachy. The implicit one is more unsettling. Section 4. Political predictions, 30 through 26. Number 30. Corruption as the default expectation. Springfield's political establishment has been corrupt for the entirety of the show's run. Not occasionally corrupt, not corrupt in specific scandalous ways that prompt reform, but structurally, blandly, casually corrupt in a way that the town's residents have entirely internalized. Mayor Quimby takes bribes. The police are ineffective and self-interested. City contracts go to the lowest bidder who is also somehow affiliated with someone on the city council. Nobody is surprised by any of this. The corruption is part of the texture of civic life, as unremarkable as the weather. The prediction embedded in this sustained depiction is not that American politics would become corrupt. Corruption in American politics has existed as long as American politics. The prediction is that the American relationship to political corruption would shift, that it would stop being something that, when revealed, generated genuine public outrage and reform, and would instead become something that people shrug at. That it would be expected, that the expectation would eliminate the outrage, and that the elimination of outrage would remove the primary mechanism of accountability. Survey data on public trust in American government institutions has declined consistently since the 1970s. The period of The Simpsons' run corresponds almost precisely to the era in which that trust reached historic lows and then stabilized there. Not because trust was restored, but because expectations adjusted downward. The show depicting corruption as normal was satire in 1989. By 2025, it reads more like realism. Number 29. The Celebrity Politician Pipeline. Across its run, the show has depicted multiple instances of celebrities running for or holding political office. The move is treated as natural within the show's universe. Fame is fame. If you are famous for one thing, the audience for that thing becomes a potential constituency. The skills required to build a public profile and the skills required to win an election have enough overlap, the managed image, the ability to perform for camera and crowd, the construction of a personal narrative that people find compelling, that the crossover is logical rather than absurd. This was a joke in the 80s and 90s. Ronald Reagan had already done it, but Reagan was treated as an exception, a historical anomaly produced by a particular moment in California politics rather than a template that would be replicated. The show treated the celebrity-to-politician move as a recurring comic premise rather than a prediction, but the premise turned out to be a description of a pathway that has become increasingly common and increasingly consequential. Arnold Schwarzenegger governed California, Al Franken served in the Senate, Jesse Ventura governed Minnesota, Donald Trump became president, Herschel Walker ran for the Senate. The show was not predicting specific individuals. It was predicting that the pipeline would exist and would be treated as unremarkable. That has happened. Number 28. Politics as entertainment product. Related to but distinct from the celebrity-politician question is the show's long-running depiction of political events as entertainment events, things designed to be watched and reacted to and experienced as dramatic content, rather than as civic processes whose primary function is the selection of people who will govern. Elections in Springfield have the texture of sporting events. Debates are performance occasions. Policy is rarely the subject. Character and spectacle and the pleasures of watching a contest with winners and losers are what the coverage offers. The transformation of American political coverage into something that resembles sports coverage more than civic journalism has been extensively documented and extensively lamented. The show was depicting it as already underway in the early 90s, as a satire of what political media had already become. The satire turned out to be anticipating the direction of travel rather than just describing a present-moment dysfunction. The entertainment logic has become more dominant, not less, in the decades since. Number 27. The vulnerability of democracy to strategic misinformation. Multiple episodes involve the Springfield population being misled by deliberate misinformation rumors, fabricated evidence, stories told to produce specific political and social outcomes rather than to convey accurate information. The specific mechanisms change. Sometimes it is a politician, sometimes it is a media figure, sometimes it is a corporation protecting its interests. But the underlying dynamic is consistent. The Springfield public is persuadable through misinformation in ways that have real consequences, and the people who understand this vulnerability are willing to exploit it. The information environment the show was satirizing has become the information environment the world actually inhabits. The specific mechanisms of that environment, social media amplification, algorithmic radicalization, state-sponsored disinformation campaigns, the erosion of shared epistemic ground were not present in the form they take today when most of these episodes were written. But the underlying human vulnerability was there, and the show was pointing at it consistently. People believe things that are told to them convincingly. People who understand this can use it. The information ecosystem determines what people believe. The information ecosystem can be engineered. These are not new insights, but the show was applying them to a recognizable American context, with a consistency that looks prescient in retrospect. Number 26. The Trump presidency. We have arrived at the most famous one in the political category, and it deserves to be considered carefully because the shorthand version of the story does not quite capture why it is more interesting than a lucky guess. The episode is called Bart to the Future. It aired on March 19, 2000. The premise involves Bart receiving a vision of his future as an adult, in which Lisa has just been elected the first female president of the United States. In the episode, Lisa refers to the budget deficit she has inherited from her predecessor. A graphic identifies that predecessor. The name on the graphic is Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump's election victory in November 2016. The staff writer who wrote that episode was Dan Greeny. He has spoken about the creative decision since the prediction became famous, and his explanation is clear and honest and illuminating. He and his colleagues were looking for the most absurd possible president to place before Lisa. In the timeline, someone who would signal the depths of dysfunction a future Lisa Simpson would have to dig the country out of. Trump was already, in 2000, a figure who had publicly flirted with running for president on multiple occasions. He was a person famous for being wealthy and famous, a tabloid fixture, a brand rather than a person in the political sense. Putting him in the White House was a joke about the logical extreme of a certain kind of American celebrity culture. The joke was that America would elect someone like that. The joke was the absurdity of it. The joke came true. But there is one more specific detail that makes this harder to dismiss as a general satirical observation about celebrity culture. In June of 2015, Donald Trump descended an escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy for president. The image of him on the escalator was broadcast everywhere and became one of the defining visual documents of that campaign announcement. And in the Bart to the Future episode, there is a visual gag, a brief moment that depicts Trump descending an escalator. The show depicted the escalator descent 15 years before the escalator descent happened. That specific visual detail, in that specific context, is the thing that elevates this above the general satire explanation. A satirical prediction about celebrity politicians could explain Trump in the White House. It does not as easily explain the escalator. Greeny, to his credit, has been thoughtful about this. He has noted that Trump had used escalators as a staging choice for public appearances on multiple occasions before the announcement, that it was part of his visual vocabulary, and that anyone paying close attention to how Trump managed his public image might have predicted that his grand political entrance would use the same theatrical vocabulary. That is a reasonable explanation. It does not fully neutralize the specificity of the detail, but it provides a plausible mechanism, which is the best any of these explanations can do. Section 5. Corporate Predictions 25 through 21. Number 25. The gig economy's power asymmetry. We touched on the gig economy earlier in the warm-up section as an observation about labor arrangements. Here we go deeper, because there is a specific dimension of the show's depiction that belongs in the corporate predictions section and that is more unsettling than the general observation. In multiple episodes depicting Homer's various short-term employment arrangements, the structure of the relationship between Homer and his temporary employer is shown with specific clarity. Homer bears the risk. The company takes the margin. When things go wrong, the costs fall on Homer in time, in money, in physical wear, on whatever equipment or assets he is using for the job. When things go well, the company captures the value. The legal structure of the relationship has been designed to make this arrangement appear to be one thing, independent contractors freely choosing to work while functioning as something else. Employees without the protections that the employment relationship is legally supposed to provide. This is the structural critique of gig work that labor scholars and policy advocates spent the 2010s trying to communicate to a public and a regulatory apparatus that was slow to receive it. The show had depicted the shape of it in the late 90s and early 2000s, with a clarity that was legible only in retrospect, because at the time the specific platforms that would scale this arrangement into a major sector of the economy did not exist. Number 24. Big Tech's relationship to democratic institutions. Several episodes across the show's run involve a corporation, usually Burns Enterprises, or a similar entity exercising influence over governmental processes in ways that should not be possible within a functioning democracy. The influence is direct and structural. The corporation does not merely lobby, it determines. The elected officials exist within a system that the corporate entity has designed and within which those officials have limited meaningful autonomy. The nominal forms of democracy, the elections, the votes, the public processes continue, but the outcomes are substantially predetermined by where the economic power sits. The specific form this has taken in reality involves technology platforms rather than industrial corporations, though the underlying dynamic is the same. The revelation that major technology companies had the ability to influence election outcomes through algorithmic choices, that social media platforms had made decisions about information flow that had measurable effects on political events, that the private entities controlling the infrastructure of public discourse were not subject to meaningful democratic accountability. These were the major ongoing conversations of the 2010s and 2020s. The show had been depicting the structural reality of this in fictional form for decades. The specific technology was new. The power relationship was not. Number 23. The Disney-Fox merger. In a 1998 episode, a graphic depicting corporate ownership shows 20th Century Fox as a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company. At the time, this was a joke. Fox was the Simpsons broadcaster. Disney was its competitor. Depicting Disney as having swallowed Fox was a gag about corporate consolidation in the media industry, an absurdist extrapolation of the direction entertainment conglomerates were heading. Funny because it seemed too on the nose to be possible. In December of 2017, Disney announced it would acquire most of 21st Century Fox's assets in a deal valued at approximately $71 billion. The acquisition was completed in March of 2019. The Simpsons is now produced by a subsidiary of Disney. The joke came true in a way that was commercially consequential for the show itself. The thing that makes this interesting as a prediction is not just that Disney bought Fox, which could be explained as a general observation about media consolidation trends. It is that the specific combination Disney acquiring Fox specifically was the one the show depicted. There are many large media companies. There are many possible consolidation combinations. The show picked the one that happened. The writers of the episode have acknowledged that the choice was not random. Disney and Fox were already in a complex, competitive relationship in 1998, with Disney's ABC network competing with Fox Broadcasting and both companies competing in the theme park and animation spaces. A person thinking carefully about where consolidation might lead in that specific competitive landscape might reasonably identify a Disney-Fox combination as a natural endpoint. That is a better explanation than chance. It is still a remarkably specific coincidence. Number 22. The ultra-wealthy as a separate legal category. Burns' relationship to legal accountability in Springfield has always been the show's most sustained satire. He commits crimes, he causes harm, he operates in consistent violation of regulatory frameworks, and nothing consequential happens to him, not because the laws do not apply to him, but because the machinery of enforcement is too intertwined with his economic interests to function in his case. The police need the plant. The town needs the electricity. The politicians need the donations. The lawyers cost more than the victims can pay. Burns moves through the world in a legal environment that nominally applies to him and practically does not. This is now a reasonably well-documented feature of American life for a specific economic tier. The literature on this, from academic work on legal dualism to journalism about specific instances of wealthy individuals avoiding consequences that would apply to anyone else, has grown substantially in the 2010s and 2020s. The phrase, "one rule for the rich and another for everyone else," had always been a populist complaint. It became a thesis supported by quantitative evidence about differential legal outcomes across economic brackets. The show was not predicting this. It was depicting something that has always been true. but it depicted it with such consistency and such structural clarity that returning to those episodes now feels like reading a case study. Number 21. Essential service control as population management. The most sophisticated element of the show's depiction of Burns is the argument never made explicitly, only illustrated through the structure of the town's dependence, that control of an essential service is control of a population. Burns does not need to govern Springfield directly. He provides the electricity. The town runs on his electricity. The town cannot meaningfully oppose him because opposing him means risking the electricity. The economic dependence is the governance. The service is the power. This dynamic has played out in specific ways in the real world that the show was not depicting directly but whose logic it had captured. The relationship between large employers and the communities dependent on their presence, where the threat of departure functions as a governing mechanism, follows the same structure. The relationship between platform companies and the businesses dependent on their infrastructure follows the same structure. The relationship between a single large employer and a company town follows the same structure. The show did not predict any specific instance. It identified the logic. The logic keeps finding new applications. Section 6. Scientific Predictions, 20 through 16. Number 20. The GMO debate's persistent irresolvability. In a 1999 episode, the town is presented with genetically modified tomatoes, large, commercially convenient, seemingly superior to natural tomatoes in several measurable ways. The town divides. Some residents are enthusiastic. Others are suspicious and frightened. The scientific case for the safety of the product is presented, but does not resolve the social and political conflict. Because the conflict is not primarily about safety. It is about trust, and about who controls the food supply, and about what it means that a technology now exists that can do this to a tomato, and whether the entity doing it to the tomato has interests aligned with the people eating the tomato. The debate has not been resolved in the 25 years since. GMO foods are now widespread in the American food supply. The scientific consensus on their safety is clear, and the public debate continues in substantially the same form as the episode depicted, because the episode was right that the debate was not primarily about the science. It was about something else, about the relationship between technology and nature, about corporate control of food, about the appropriate limits of modification, and those are questions that scientific evidence does not answer. The show understood that the debate would persist not because the science was unclear, but because the debate was not really about the science. Number 19. Mass surveillance before Snowden. In a 2000 episode and in several episodes across the late 90s, the show depicted government and corporate surveillance of private citizens at a scale and detail that would have seemed paranoid to many viewers at the time. Phone calls monitored, communications intercepted, data collected on ordinary people's movements and behaviors and associations. The monitoring is presented as having been going on for some time, normalized within the apparatus that conducts it, even if not within the public awareness. In June of 2013, Edward Snowden's disclosures about the NSA's surveillance programs revealed that the United States government had been collecting information on the phone calls, emails, and internet activity of American citizens on a scale that was substantially larger than the public had known or most observers had assumed. The programs had been running for years. The surveillance infrastructure was real and extensive and aimed at ordinary people's communications, not just at suspected foreign agents. The show's depiction of surveillance in the late 90s and early 2000s reads differently after Snowden than it did before. Before, it seemed like paranoid satire. After, it seems like a reasonably accurate description of what was actually happening. The timeline on this is interesting. The show was depicting as satirical exaggeration, something that was simultaneously being built into reality. The surveillance state was being constructed during the same years the show was making jokes about it. Number 18. Personalized genetic medicine. In a 2001 episode, the possibility of medical treatment tailored to an individual's specific genetic profile is depicted. The premise involves understanding a person's genetic makeup and using that understanding to provide medical interventions designed for that specific biology rather than for a generalized population. The framing is comedic, but the concept is clear and specific. The future of medicine is personal, is genetic, is about the individual rather than the average. Personalized medicine, sometimes called precision medicine, is now a major and growing field. The Human Genome Project was completed in 2003. CRISPR gene editing technology arrived in the early 2010s. Clinical genomics is now used to guide cancer treatment, to identify hereditary disease risk, and to tailor drug dosing to individual genetic profiles in ways that meaningfully improve outcomes. The concept the show depicted in 2001 as a speculative possibility is now standard practice in several branches of medicine and a guiding vision for the field's development. Number 17. The Higgs boson. This is where the scientific predictions begin to become genuinely strange. In a 2000 episode, Homer is depicted working on a mathematical problem on a chalkboard. The equation visible in the scene was written for the show by David H. Sheminovich, a physicist who worked at Columbia University. The equation on the chalkboard, which appears briefly in the background of a comedy scene, is not a random arrangement of mathematical symbols. It is a functional equation that, when solved, produces a numerical prediction for the mass of a particle. In July of 2012, physicists at CERN announced the experimental confirmation of the Higgs boson, the particle whose theoretical existence had been predicted since the 1960s, and whose detection required the construction of the Large Hadron Collider. The experimentally confirmed mass of the Higgs boson was approximately 125 giga-electronvolts. The equation on Homer's chalkboard in 2000, if you solve it, produces a prediction of approximately 125 giga-electronvolts. The show predicted the mass of the Higgs boson 12 years before its experimental confirmation. This is not a vague satirical gesture at a general trend. This is a specific numerical prediction that turned out to be correct. The mechanism is explainable. Sheminovich, a professional physicist, was working from the theoretical physics of the time and wrote an equation that reflected the best theoretical understanding of what the Higgs mass might be. The theoretical physics community had constraints on the Higgs mass that, while not pinpointing the exact value, narrowed the range significantly. An equation built on those constraints would produce a result somewhere in the right neighborhood. It was not a random guess. It was a physicist doing physics and getting a result that the experimental community would confirm 12 years later. But it is still a specific number, in a background gag. In a cartoon about a family in a fictional American town? That is strange. Number 16. The donut-shaped universe. And then there is this one. In a 2001 episode, Homer develops a theory about the shape of the universe. His theory proposes that the universe is not infinite and flat, not spherical, but shaped like a torus, a donut. Homer, in his particular way, becomes convinced that the universe curves back on itself in a specific, donut-shaped topology. This is played for comedy. Homer is not a physicist. His conclusion is arrived at through characteristic Homer reasoning, rather than through rigorous cosmological analysis. The joke is that Homer's donut obsession has extended to his cosmology. But the underlying idea is not a joke. In 2003, researchers analyzing data from the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe, a NASA satellite studying the cosmic microwave background radiation, found patterns in that radiation that some cosmologists interpreted as evidence that the universe might have a more complex topology than the standard, infinite flat model. The shapes proposed to explain the anomalous patterns included, among others, a toroidal shape, a donut. The Simpsons depicted Homer's donut universe theory in 2001. Researchers published papers in 2003 and beyond, arguing, based on actual cosmic microwave background data, that a toroidal universe was consistent with what they were observing. The question of the universe's global topology remains genuinely open in cosmology. The donut option remains on the table. Homer's theory, arrived at for entirely the wrong reasons through entirely the wrong method, is not obviously wrong. This one sits at number 16 rather than higher because the Higgs boson prediction was more specific and more confirmed. But the donut universe is arguably stranger in its origins because the Higgs prediction came from a physicist doing physics and the donut universe came from a writer imagining what Homer's donut obsession might extend to. The Higgs equation was intentional. The donut universe was a joke, and the joke was not wrong. Section 7. Cultural predictions 15 through 11. Number 15. Reality television and the audience's complicity. The show depicted reality television, specifically the kind that places ordinary people in artificial situations and films their responses for entertainment before it became dominant. The first major wave of modern reality television in America, usually dated to the twin arrivals of Survivor and Big Brother in the summer of 2000, was preceded by Simpsons episodes that depicted the format, made jokes about it, and raised the specific critique that would later be made about it by critics and academics. The critique embedded in those early episodes is more interesting than the prediction of the format itself. The show was not just saying, there will be a kind of television that films ordinary people. It was asking, what does it mean that we want to watch that? What does the audience's appetite for it reveal about the audience? What is the relationship between the viewer and the people being filmed? And is that relationship straightforwardly entertaining, or is it also something else, voyeuristic, condescending, exploitative in some way that the entertainment pleasure is designed to obscure? These are now the standard questions that scholars of media and culture ask about reality television. The show was raising them as satirical observations before there was a real reality television industry to ask them about. The format arrived, the questions arrived with it. The show had already staged the debate. Number 14. The music industry's economic collapse. Multiple episodes from the late 90s onward depict musicians, including characters who have achieved genuine fame and success in states of financial distress that should not be consistent with that success. The fame is real. The audiences are real. The money is not there in the way that the fame would seem to warrant. The episode-by-episode details vary, but the underlying observation is consistent. The relationship between making successful music and deriving financial benefit from that success was already being uncoupled. The music industry's economic transformation over the following 2 decades was dramatic. Digital downloads reduced the revenue from music sales. Streaming reduced it further and redistributed what remained away from artists and toward platforms. The touring economy became the primary income source for most working musicians, while the recorded music they were famous for generated almost no direct income for most of the people who made it. This is now the standard economic situation for most musicians. The show was depicting the early stages of it in the late 90s, when the uncoupling was beginning but had not yet fully resolved into the structural reality that now defines the industry. Number 13. Short-form viral video. In a late 90s episode, a short video clip of something funny happening, an accident, a pratfall, something brief and visually striking and mildly chaotic spreads rapidly through Springfield. The spreading is the story. The content is almost secondary. The mechanism by which a short piece of video becomes a cultural reference point that everyone has seen and can refer to is what the episode is examining. America's funniest home videos existed. The internet did not yet have the infrastructure to support viral video at scale when these episodes aired. YouTube was founded in 2005. TikTok became a dominant platform in the early 2020s. The short-form viral video format, a piece of content, usually under a minute, that spreads rapidly through a network and becomes a shared cultural reference for a period before being replaced by the next one, is now one of the primary units of cultural experience for large portions of the global population. The show was not predicting the specific platform. It was predicting the appetite that audiences would want very short, very surprising, broadly accessible visual content that they could share with others and reference in conversation. That appetite was already present. The show saw it. The platforms that arrived later were built on satisfying it. Number 12. Celebrity relationships as media product. Across its run, the show has repeatedly depicted the romantic relationships of celebrities as content products, as things that exist partly or primarily as stories that media entities can tell and audiences can consume. The actual relationship is real, but it is also a narrative, and the narrative has producers and an audience and commercial considerations that shape its arc. This is now an entirely normalized aspect of how celebrity culture operates. The term public relations relationship, a romantic partnership that is constructed or managed, at least partly for publicity purposes, is part of mainstream cultural vocabulary. The coverage of celebrity relationships as episodic entertainment content, with beginnings and middles and dramatic endings and fan investments and outcomes, is a major sector of the media economy. The show was depicting the logic of it decades before the specific platforms and formats that have made it so dominant existed in their current form. The logic was already there. The platforms expanded it. Number 11. Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra. Now we reach the part of the cultural predictions section that is genuinely strange. In a 1996 episode called Homerpalooza, The Simpsons depicted a music festival. Among the acts at the festival is the hip-hop group Cypress Hill. In the episode, Cypress Hill appears at the festival alongside a symphony orchestra, the London Symphony Orchestra. The joke is that Cypress Hill accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra, or the orchestra accidentally ended up on the same bill, or some combination of miscommunication that results in the very unexpected pairing of a hip-hop group known for aggressive, bass-heavy music and one of the world's oldest and most prestigious classical ensembles. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall in London. The collaboration was real. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate artistic decision, planned and produced and promoted as a significant cultural event. 28 years between the joke and the reality. But there is one more detail that makes this more than coincidence. In interviews following the Royal Albert Hall performance, Be Real, one of Cypress Hill's founding members and its primary vocalist, acknowledged that the group was aware of the Simpsons episode. He was asked directly about it. He did not deny that the episode was a factor in making the collaboration real. He confirmed the awareness. The implication, and he did not deny this implication, is that the group had thought about the joke for years, that having their band depicted doing something on a famous television show put the idea in a cultural space where it could become real, and that at some point the joke stopped being a joke and became something they actually wanted to do. If that is true and Be Real's interview is the closest thing to confirmation available, then The Simpsons did not just predict this collaboration, it generated it. The show did not forecast a future that was going to happen anyway. It put an idea into the world that then became real because it had been put into the world. That is a different kind of prediction than an observation that turns out to be accurate. That is cultural causation. The show caused the thing it appeared to predict. This belongs at number 11 rather than higher because the causal mechanism is somewhat confirmed and somewhat speculative, and because higher on the list there are predictions where no such mechanism is available and the specificity is more striking. But the Cypress Hill collaboration is the most interesting example of a specific phenomenon the show as cultural cause, rather than cultural profit, that the meta-theory section will explore more fully. Section 8. Pandemic and Disaster Predictions. 10 through 6. Number 10. The Cashless Society. Multiple episodes across the show's run depict scenarios in which physical currency is absent from economic transactions. Scenarios where money exists, but not as objects that are touched and passed between people. The specific mechanism varies by episode and era, but the direction is consistent. The world is moving toward a form of exchange that is conducted entirely through systems, through records, through devices, without the physical reality of bills and coins. The COVID-19 pandemic significantly accelerated the movement toward cashless commerce in many economies. Physical currency had already been declining as a percentage of transactions in most developed economies for years, but the pandemic created strong incentives in infection risk, convenience, contactless payment infrastructure to reduce or eliminate physical cash interactions in retail and service contexts. Several countries moved substantially closer to cashless economies during the pandemic period than they had previously been. The show had been depicting this as a direction of travel for decades. The pandemic compressed the timeline. Number 9. Nuclear plant failure dynamics. The show has depicted nuclear power plant failures of various kinds across its run, and several of those depictions contain technical details about how plant failures begin and propagate that turned out to be accurate in ways that were validated by real events. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in Japan in March of 2011 unfolded in ways that were structurally similar to several failure scenarios The Simpsons had depicted at the Springfield plant. Not identical, the real disaster was caused by the interaction of an earthquake and a subsequent tsunami, specific to that geography and that moment. But the dynamics of a cascading failure, where one system fails and the failure propagates through backup systems that are not designed to handle the specific sequence of events, where decisions made under time pressure by people with incomplete information lead to outcomes that the systems were theoretically designed to prevent, that dynamic was present in both the fictional and the real events. The show had Homer as safety inspector for decades. Homer's systematic failures of safety vigilance were played for comedy, but the technical advisors who worked with the show on depicting the plant's systems had to get the physics and engineering at least roughly right for the satire to work, and the rough rightness turned out to encompass some of the failure modes that real plant disasters involve. Number 8. Municipal water contamination. The show has repeatedly depicted the Springfield water supply as contaminated as containing substances that it should not contain, that are harmful to the people drinking it, that are the result of industrial activity upstream or nearby or directly adjacent to the water source. The contamination is sometimes explicitly linked to the nuclear plant. Sometimes it is a more generic industrial source. The contamination is usually treated as a known but unaddressed problem, something that the relevant authorities are aware of and have chosen not to respond to adequately because the costs of response exceed whatever they have decided the affected population is worth. The Flint, Michigan water crisis, which became a major national story in 2015 and 2016, was precisely this scenario. The city of Flint had switched its water source in a cost-cutting measure. The water from the new source was corrosive to the old pipes and began leaching lead into the supply. Lead levels in the water reached dangerous thresholds. Children in the city showed elevated blood lead levels. The authorities were slow to respond and in some cases actively obscured the problem rather than disclosing it. The affected population was predominantly poor and predominantly black, and the differential response to their contamination versus what might have occurred in a wealthier or whiter community became part of the national conversation about environmental justice. The Simpsons had been depicting the logic of this scenario: the industrial contamination, the governmental indifference, the sacrificed population for decades before Flint, not as prophecy, as satire of a pattern of behavior in American governance and industry that was well established before the show began. But the pattern the show was satirizing is the same pattern that produced Flint. Number 7. Murder Hornets and the Pandemic, the same episode. In a 1993 episode called Marge in Chains, Springfield is struck by a flu virus that has spread from Asia. The town panics. People engage in anxious preparation. The medical system is stressed. The search for a cure becomes urgent and frantic. And in the middle of the town's panic about the virus, a separate problem arrives. A swarm of bees is accidentally released into the community, adding a second crisis to the first. In the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic was in its early phases in the United States. Simultaneously, in the American Pacific Northwest, a new invasive species was identified: Asian giant hornets, significantly larger than native North American hornets, with a sting powerful enough to be potentially fatal in cases of multiple stings or allergic reaction. The tabloid and social media nickname that attached to them immediately was murder hornets. The discovery generated intense media coverage and public anxiety during a period when the public was already experiencing intense media coverage and public anxiety about the pandemic. A pandemic spreading from Asia, combined with a crisis involving a particularly alarming variety of stinging insect in the same news cycle. In the same episode of The Simpsons, from 1993. This one is lower on the list than it probably ranks in terms of public recognition, because the coincidence has two components that each require separate explanation. The pandemic component is addressed more fully at number 2. The murder hornet component is its own thing, a very specific coincidental pairing of two events in the real world that the show had depicted in the same episode 27 years earlier. Taken together, the dual coincidence pandemic plus alarming bees from the same episode produces a feeling that requires a moment to process. Even knowing the statistical argument, even knowing about confirmation bias, the specificity of the pairing is unusual. Number 6. Marge in Chains and COVID-19, the full accounting. Let us stay with Marge in Chains a little longer, because the full accounting of its relationship to COVID-19 is more extensive than the murder hornets comparison and more interesting than the shorthand version allows. The episode depicts a flu-like illness that originates in Asia specifically. A factory worker in Japan who is ill sneezes into a package being prepared for shipping, and the virus travels inside that package to Springfield. The virus spreads through the community rapidly. The medical system in Springfield becomes overwhelmed. The town scrambles for a cure and focuses on a potential vaccine or treatment that is promised but slow to arrive. In the absence of an effective treatment, community members resort to folk remedies, some of which are ineffective and some of which are counterproductive. The authorities communicate inconsistently. Public trust in the official response varies and is sometimes undermined by the communications themselves. Against COVID-19, a respiratory illness originating in Asia. Concerns about early international spread through travel and shipping. Overwhelmed medical systems. A vaccine developed under extraordinary time pressure, a period during which folk remedies, unproven treatments, and misinformation competed with official guidance, inconsistent official communication that damaged public trust. These are the documented features of the real pandemic. The correspondences are not perfect. The specific mechanism of transmission is different. The specific medical features of the illness are different. The specific political and regulatory context is different. The Simpsons did not predict COVID-19 in any technically precise sense, but the episode captures the social and institutional experience of a pandemic. The panic, the misinformation, the overwhelmed systems, the inconsistent authority, the desperate search for treatment with enough accuracy that returning to it during the actual pandemic was a genuinely disorienting experience for many viewers. The episode is 27 years old. The social dynamics it depicts are, in their essential features, recognizable from lived experience. That is more than you can say for most 30-year-old television. Section 9. The Top 5. Number 5. Ebola the Book Cover. In a 1997 episode, Marge is trying to find something to read to cheer up a bedridden Bart. She holds up a book, and the camera briefly shows its cover. The book is titled Curious George and the Ebola Virus. This is a visual gag. A quick background detail, the camera moves on. The book is not relevant to anything that happens in the episode. Ebola hemorrhagic fever was not unknown in 1997. The virus had been identified in 1976. An outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1995 had generated international news coverage. But Ebola in 1997 was primarily understood as a disease of remote regions of Central Africa, not as a global health threat, not as something that would reach American hospitals. In 2014, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa became the largest in the disease's history. It spread to multiple countries and produced thousands of deaths. It reached the United States through healthcare workers who had been treating patients abroad. For several months, it dominated American news coverage and generated significant public fear. The Centers for Disease Control issued guidance. Airlines implemented screening. Hospitals prepared protocols. Ebola became an American concern in 2014, in a way it had not been in 1997. And a Simpsons episode from 1997 had a visual gag treating Ebola as a children's book premise. The timing matters here in a specific way. The gag works in 1997 precisely because Ebola feels distant and somewhat exotic. The joke is that connecting Curious George, a beloved children's character, with a hemorrhagic fever is absurd and somewhat dark, and the absurdity and the darkness come from the incongruity. If Ebola were already a mainstream American health concern in 1997, the joke would not work the same way. The joke depends on Ebola being something the audience knows exists but does not consider immediately threatening to themselves. And then the joke's premise became relevant 17 years later. Number 4. September 11th. The magnitude, not the mechanism. This one requires care and precision because the claim that The Simpsons predicted the September 11th terrorist attacks is one that the show's creators have explicitly and appropriately rejected. And the rejection is correct if the claim is interpreted in the strong form. The show did not predict that specific attacks on those specific targets on that specific date. That would require something beyond observation or pattern recognition or extrapolation from trends, and there is no credible evidence that the show had any such information. But there is a weaker and more accurate version of the claim that is worth considering carefully. In a 1990s episode, a tourist brochure for New York City depicts the Manhattan skyline. In the brochure's graphic, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center appear beside a dollar sign specifically. The image is arranged so that the towers visually resemble the number 11, and the dollar sign is positioned to suggest the overall image reads as a dollar amount. The image is noted because the arrangement produces a visual association that some viewers, watching after the fact, interpreted as encoding a date. This is almost certainly a coincidence. The image was not designed to encode a date. The creators have been clear about this. The interpretation requires a specific reading of an ambiguous visual that was most likely not intended to produce that reading. What is less clearly coincidental is the show's sustained attention to the Twin Towers as symbols of American economic and cultural power, and to New York City as a place of concentrated cultural and economic significance that was also, in various episodes, a site of vulnerability and threat. Across multiple episodes the towers appear. Across multiple episodes, New York is depicted in ways that engage with both its grandeur and its fragility. These are observations made by people who love New York and think carefully about what it represents. They are not predictions of specific events, but they reflect an attentiveness to the symbolic and actual significance of the World Trade Center that, viewed after the fact, resonates in ways that purely coincidental images would not. The show understood what those buildings meant. The show had been engaging with what they meant for years. When they were destroyed, the show's prior engagement felt different in retrospect, not predictive, but aware in a way that simple coincidence does not fully account for. This belongs at number 4, handled carefully, because the stronger claims about this entry are not supportable, and the weaker but more honest version is genuinely worth thinking about. Number 3. The iPad 3 correct details in one. In a 2000 episode, a flat rectangular electronic device is depicted. The device has a screen that covers most of its face. The device is used for media consumption, communication, and various applications. The character using it interacts with it through touch rather than through buttons. The device is used while lying on a couch, carried casually, integrated into daily life as a natural extension of what a person has in their hands while they are not doing anything else in particular. The Apple iPad was announced in January of 2010, 10 years after the episode. It was exactly what the show had depicted. A flat, screen-forward device used primarily through touch, designed for casual media consumption and communication, the size and shape that made sense for holding while sitting or lying down. 3 specific details were correct: the form factor, the interaction mode, and the use context. The form factor, flat rectangle, screen dominant, was the key design choice that distinguished the iPad from prior tablet concepts, which tended to be thicker and more utilitarian. The interaction mode, touch rather than stylus or buttons, was the key user experience decision that made the iPad feel natural rather than laborious. The use context, casual consumption on a couch, in bed, during the in-between moments of the day, was the market insight that drove iPad adoption in ways that more work-focused tablet computers had not achieved. The show got all 3 in 2000, 10 years before the product launched. The explanation is available. Tablet computers had been in development in various forms for decades. Touch interfaces had been demonstrated. The direction of travel was legible to anyone paying attention to technology trends and thinking carefully about how people actually use devices in their daily lives rather than in idealized productivity scenarios. A smart writer thinking about what a computer would look like when it was fully optimized for casual personal use could reason their way to something like the iPad description. That explanation is plausible. The specificity of the match 3 separate design choices, all correct, is still worth sitting with for a moment. And then there is the FaceTime detail. In the same era of episodes, characters in the show use their flat communication devices to make video calls with other people. They hold the device in front of their face. The other person appears on the screen. The interaction is clearly recognizable as what Apple would name FaceTime when it launched in 2010 alongside the iPhone 4. The device, the form factor, the touch interface, and the video calling application, all of it is present in Simpsons episodes from around 2000. This belongs at number 3 rather than higher because the iPad's design concept was in enough technical discourse by 2000 that a thoughtful observer could plausibly converge on it. The specificity is striking. The mechanism is available. Higher on the list are predictions where the mechanism is less available. Number 2. The voting machine. In 2008, a Halloween episode of The Simpsons, part of the annual Treehouse of Horror tradition, which allows the show to tell darker and more surreal stories without being bound by regular continuity, featured a short segment involving an electronic voting machine. In the segment, Homer attempts to cast his vote in a presidential election. The machine malfunctions. Homer's vote is repeatedly changed to the candidate he is not trying to select. He tries to correct this. The machine continues to register the wrong candidate. His vote is stolen, not through human malfeasance but through machine error or the appearance of machine error. The segment is brief and comedic. It runs for a few minutes and is played for laughs. Homer is frustrated. The machine is indifferent. The vote goes wrong. In 2012, technicians at a polling location in Pennsylvania reported that a touchscreen voting machine appeared to be changing votes, registering a different candidate from the one the voter had selected. Video of the apparent malfunction was posted online and circulated widely. Similar reports had come in from previous elections. The issue of electronic voting machine reliability and the potential for vote-changing errors, either through malfunction or through vulnerability to tampering, became a major concern in American election security discussions through the 2010s and into the 2020s. The debate about voting machine security shaped political discourse, legislative battles, post-election disputes, and public trust in electoral outcomes throughout the period following 2008. The specific concern that the machines could change your vote, that you could try to vote for one candidate and the machine could register another, was the concern depicted in the Simpsons segment. The show had depicted it in 2008 as a Halloween joke, as an absurdist premise for a comedic bit in a tradition that exists specifically to explore fears and anxieties through comedy. The fear turned out to be real. The concern turned out to be one of the organizing anxieties of American democracy for the better part of a decade and a half. A Halloween segment about a machine that steals your vote became, without anyone planning it, a prescient document of what American voters would be afraid of and fighting about for years. This belongs at number 2 rather than number 1, because the general anxiety about electronic voting was already present in some technical and advocacy communities in 2008, and a show thinking about what fears belonged in a Halloween episode might reasonably have landed on it as a contemporary anxiety worth depicting. The specificity is very high. The mechanism is partially available. Number 1. The Higgs boson equation revisited. We discussed this in the scientific predictions section, but it belongs here again at number 1 because the full weight of it deserves a moment in the right context, without the surrounding noise of other predictions nearby. The Higgs boson prediction is not the most culturally resonant item on this list. The Trump presidency is more famous, the voting machine is more politically consequential, the Ebola book cover is more visceral, the iPad is more practically specific. But none of those is the most inexplicable. The Higgs boson equation ranks first because it is a specific number, produced by real physics, verified by the largest and most expensive scientific instrument in human history, placed as a background detail in a cartoon about a man who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into a reactor core to see if it would grow bigger. The mechanism is available. A physicist consulting on the episode wrote an equation reflecting contemporary theoretical constraints on the Higgs boson mass. The theoretical physics community had constraints on the Higgs mass that narrowed the range significantly. An equation built on those constraints would produce a result somewhere in the right neighborhood. It was not a random guess. It was a physicist doing physics. The physicist did physics. In a cartoon. In the background. And the physics was right. The experimental confirmation came 12 years later, from a machine built partly for that purpose, at a cost of approximately $10 billion, after decades of theoretical work by thousands of physicists around the world. The result matched the number on Homer Simpson's chalkboard. That is where the list ends. Not with drama or spectacle or cultural resonance, but with a specific number on a chalkboard in a cartoon and a machine in Switzerland that confirmed it 12 years later. That is the most insane Simpsons prediction. Section 10. The ones that didn't come true. It is important to spend time here because any honest accounting of the prediction phenomenon has to include the misses. The predictions that were wrong. The futures the show imagined that have not materialized and may not. These are the ones that never get screenshotted and shared. The ones that the confirmation bias engine of internet culture quietly drops from the ledger, and their absence from the public conversation about Simpsons predictions is itself evidence for how the phenomenon works. Jetpacks and personal flight devices. The show, across its run, has depicted personal aviation devices, jetpacks, individual flying vehicles, personal aircraft that a single person operates to get from one place to another without roads or trains or commercial aviation. The future The Simpsons imagined included a sky full of individual pilots moving through a three-dimensional transportation infrastructure rather than the linear two-dimensional one we actually have. We do not have jetpacks in any meaningful consumer sense. We have companies with prototypes. We have demonstrations that look impressive in controlled conditions. We have vehicles that sort of work for limited use cases under limited conditions. We do not have a viable personal aviation market that has changed how ordinary people get around in daily life. This has been the future for 6 decades and continues to be the future, perpetually 5 to 10 years away, which is the same distance it has maintained since the 1960s. The show imagined it would arrive. It has not. This matters because jetpacks and flying cars are exactly the kind of obvious futurist fantasy that a show set in a fictional America would reach for. They represent a certain version of the future that mid-century optimism embedded in popular culture and that has remained stubbornly imaginary despite decades of effort and investment. The Simpsons imagined this future alongside everyone else who was imagining futures at that time. The fact that it has not come true is not surprising. The fact that nobody remembers the show predicting it is also not surprising. The prediction is forgettable precisely because it was wrong. The Moon Colony. Multiple episodes across the show's run depict humanity having established a permanent presence on the moon, a functioning colony, a community, an ongoing human enterprise beyond Earth's atmosphere. This felt like a reasonable forecast in the context of the space optimism that followed Apollo. The trajectory of the 60s and 70s suggested that the moon was just the beginning, that permanent human habitation beyond Earth was a matter of decades rather than generations. We have not returned to the moon since December of 1972. The Artemis program aims to do so. A permanent lunar colony is not a near-term reality by any honest assessment of current capabilities and political will. The moon colony prediction has been wrong for over 50 years and continues to be wrong, and it belongs on this list precisely because it was a confident, repeated, clearly articulated prediction from a show that other confident and clearly articulated predictions turned out to be right about. The wrongness is instructive. The moon colony was the kind of future that seemed inevitable at a specific historical moment and then became contingent when the political will and the funding shifted. The show was not wrong to imagine it. The show was reflecting the reasonable expectations of the era, and the era's expectations were wrong. That is a different kind of wrong from careless speculation. It is the wrongness that comes from correctly observing a trend and incorrectly assuming the trend would continue. Trends stop. Political will shifts. The moon became the moon again instead of a starting point. Artificial intelligence as companion and confidant. The show has depicted AI systems that function as meaningful social presences, as entities that interact with humans in ways that feel like relationship rather than utility. This prediction has been partially right, in that AI systems now exist that can conduct extended conversations and that some people do relate to with something resembling social investment. But the specific form the show imagined an AI that is a genuine companion, integrated into emotional life in the way a person might be, has arrived in a partial and contested form rather than the clean, obvious form the show depicted. This may be a matter of timing rather than direction. The technology is moving very fast. What seems partially realized now may seem more fully realized in a decade. But there is also a real question about whether the relationship between humans and AI systems will ever take the form that the show imagined, because that form assumes a kind of mutual recognition, the AI recognizing the human recognizing the AI as something that recognizes them, that the current generation of systems does not quite achieve, and that may not be achievable through the current approaches. The prediction may be wrong not because the technology cannot be built, but because what the technology produces is not quite what was imagined. Universal Animal Communication Translation. In several episodes, a device translates animal sounds into human comprehensible language. The family dog's barks are rendered as sentences. The cat's meows become words. The show imagines a future in which the communication barrier between humans and other animals has been technologically bridged, in which the inner lives of animals become accessible to human understanding through technology. We cannot do this. We have made significant and fascinating progress in understanding animal communication, the complexity of whale song, the semantic content of bee dances, the language capacities of great apes, the communicative sophistication of corvids and cephalopods. But the universal translator that allows you to know what your dog is saying in human comprehensible sentences has not arrived. Some researchers believe it may not be achievable in the form the show imagines, because what animals communicate may not map onto the linguistic categories that a human language-based translator would use. The premise may be wrong at the level of the assumption, not just at the level of the technology. Animals may not have the kind of linguistic intent that translation would require. Their communication may be real and complex without being translatable in the way human language is translatable. The show imagined translation as a technology problem. It may actually be a category problem. The full robot labor replacement. The show has depicted economic scenarios in which robots have replaced human workers extensively, not just in specific industries, but broadly, reshaping the labor market across many sectors in ways that produce either utopian abundance or dystopian unemployment, depending on the episode's tone. Some versions of this show it as liberating, some as catastrophic, but the consistent prediction is that the replacement would be comprehensive and relatively fast. Automation has advanced. It has affected specific industries significantly. It has not produced the comprehensive displacement of human labor that the show's most dramatic depictions imagined. The economists debate about whether this time is different, whether AI and robotics represent a categorical shift in the relationship between technology and employment, rather than another chapter in the long history of technology creating new jobs as it destroys old ones is ongoing and unresolved. The show may turn out to be right over a longer time horizon. As of now, the comprehensive robotic replacement of human labor remains a prediction rather than a reality, and the jobs that have been automated away have, so far, been replaced by other jobs rather than by leisure and abundance or by mass unemployment. The net effect has been wage stagnation and increased inequality rather than the cleaner narrative of replacement that the show depicted. The flying car. This deserves its own entry separate from jetpacks because the flying car is such a specific and recurring cultural prediction that it has taken on a life of its own as a symbol of futures that were promised and not delivered. Multiple episodes depict flying cars as part of the ordinary transportation landscape of a near future. The vision is specific, a car, or something very like a car, that operates both on roads and in the air, that individual families own and operate, that changes the relationship between distance and time in ways that the car itself changed those relationships in the 20th century. We do not have flying cars. There are companies working on urban air mobility vehicles, on electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, on concepts that are sometimes marketed as flying cars or air taxis. None of these is what the show imagined, and none is available to ordinary families in the way the show imagined. The flying car, like the jetpack, is the future that the future has repeatedly declined to provide. The wrongness of the flying car prediction is instructive in the same way as the wrongness of the moon colony prediction. Both of these were confident extrapolations from genuine trends. The post-war American relationship to the car, and to the car as a symbol of freedom and mobility and individual capacity, made the flying car feel like the natural next step. The space program made the moon colony feel like the natural next step. Both extrapolations failed not because the technology was impossible, but because the social, political, and economic conditions that would have made them happen did not materialize in the way the extrapolations assumed. Prediction fails when it correctly identifies a direction but incorrectly assumes that the direction will be followed. Directions change, priorities shift, resources go elsewhere. The show was right about the direction. The direction stopped being the direction. What these misses tell us? The misses collectively tell us something important about how to understand the hits. A show that has produced 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about the future of American life will, through volume alone, get some things right. The things it gets right become famous. The things it gets wrong disappear from the cultural ledger. What remains is a highlight reel that appears to document prophecy but is actually documenting a selection mechanism that keeps the hits and discards the misses. This does not mean the hits are unimpressive. It does not mean the Higgs boson equation or the Trump escalator or the Disney-Fox merger or the pandemic episode are uninteresting. They are interesting. But their interestingness should be understood in the context of how many predictions the show has made that were wrong, and how those wrong predictions have been quietly allowed to vanish from the record. The confirmation bias that surrounds Simpsons predictions is not a conspiracy. Nobody is deliberately hiding the wrong predictions. They simply do not generate the same emotional response as the right ones. When you see that the show depicted Trump's presidency 16 years before it happened, that produces a specific feeling, a slightly uncanny recognition, a sense of something being off in an interesting way, and that feeling makes the clip shareable and memorable. When the show depicts flying cars that have not arrived, the lack of arrival does not produce any feeling at all. You watch the episode, you notice the flying cars, and you continue watching. There is no moment of recognition, no uncanny resonance, no reason to reach for your phone and share the clip. The Simpsons is not a prophet. It is a very long, very smart show that has been thinking carefully about America for 36 years. Some of what it has imagined is accurate. Much of what it has imagined is not. The accurate parts are the ones that get remembered. That is how human memory and internet culture and confirmation bias work. The Simpsons is not magic. It is volume and intelligence and selection, and the combination produces something that looks like prophecy when you are standing close to it and squinting. Section 11. The Writer's Room. Before we get to the final meditation, it is worth spending some time inside the actual mechanism that produced all of these predictions, because understanding how the show was made helps explain both why it was right so often and why the explanation for its rightness is less mystical than the internet tends to suggest. The Simpsons writing staff has been, across the show's run, one of the most formally educated television writing rooms in the history of the medium. The early seasons in particular featured writers with degrees from elite universities, Harvard, Yale, and others in fields ranging from philosophy and literature to mathematics and computer science. Several writers had backgrounds in science. Several had backgrounds in economics. Several were deeply read in political theory, cultural criticism, and the history of ideas. This matters because the show's predictions are not the product of mystical insight. They are the product of intelligent, broadly educated people who spent their professional lives thinking carefully about American culture and using that careful thinking as raw material for comedy. Consider what that process actually looks like in practice. A writer on The Simpsons in 1998 is not trying to predict the future. They are trying to write a joke. The joke needs to be funny. The joke also needs to be grounded in something recognizable, something that connects to the audience's experience or their sense of where the world is heading. A joke about a technology that feels completely alien falls flat. A joke about a technology that feels like an obvious extrapolation from something the audience already knows lands better. So the writer looks at where technology is heading. They look at what is already being built and tested and deployed in early versions. They think about how a particular technology, taken to its logical conclusion, would change daily life. And they write a joke about that conclusion. The joke is funny because it feels true. It feels true because the writer is accurately reading a trend. And sometimes, the trend continues in the direction the writer read, and 20 years later the joke looks like prophecy. But the writer was not trying to predict. The writer was trying to be funny in a way that required being accurate. This is the most important single thing to understand about Simpsons predictions. The show was not optimized for prophecy. It was optimized for comedy. The predictions are a byproduct of the comedy. When the comedy requires accurate observation of how the world works and where it is going, and when the world then goes in that direction, the comedy becomes prediction retroactively. The intention was always just to make the joke land. The education of the writer's room is relevant for another reason as well. Writers with backgrounds in science and mathematics were not just making jokes about technology and science. They were sometimes doing actual science inside the jokes. The Higgs boson equation is the clearest example of this. A real physicist, working on the show, wrote a real equation, and the equation was right. That is not mystical. That is a physicist who knows what a correct equation looks like writing a correct equation. But it points to something real about the show. The technical content of many Simpsons jokes is not fake. The math, where it appears, is often real math. The science, where it appears, is often real science. The show employed people who could write actual scientific content into their comedy, and those people wrote actual scientific content into their comedy, and some of that content turned out to be accurate. Understanding the writer's room also helps explain the misses. The flying car and the moon colony and the AI companion were not wrong predictions from a show that was usually right. They were predictions that fell into the category of cultural optimism futures that seemed inevitable based on the trajectory of the 50s and 60s and 70s, futures that a writer who was culturally literate would naturally include because they were part of the ambient expectation of what the future would look like. The show absorbed those futures from the culture it was satirizing, and the culture on those particular futures turned out to be wrong. The predictions the show got right tend to be predictions that came from careful observation of specific, visible trends. The predictions the show got wrong tend to be predictions that came from general cultural optimism about what technology and science would eventually deliver. The former required the writers to look at what was actually happening. The latter required them only to absorb what people hoped would happen. One of those is a skill. The other is a hope. The skill has a better track record than the hope. There is one more element of the writer's room that deserves attention before we leave it: the length of the show's run. 800 episodes over 36 years is a very long time to be a cultural institution. The show has been in production across almost the entirety of the modern era of American life. It has been writing jokes about technology since before the internet was publicly accessible. It has been writing jokes about politics since before most of its current viewers were born. It has been writing jokes about American economic life since before the word gig economy existed. The volume of content matters not just statistically, although it does matter statistically, but because the show has been observing American life for long enough that many of its early observations have had the time to play out. A joke made in 1993 has had 30 years to be either confirmed or refuted by events. Most jokes from any given comedy show do not get that kind of time. Most shows are off the air before the world catches up to their observations or refutes them. The Simpsons has stayed on long enough to find out whether it was right, and the ones where it was right are now visible in a way that they would not be if the show had ended after 5 seasons. The length of the run is part of the prediction phenomenon. The show made many observations. The show stayed on long enough for many of those observations to resolve. The ones that resolved in the direction the show pointed became famous. The ones that did not resolve that way were forgotten. The run length gave the show enough time for confirmation bias to accumulate into something that looks like a pattern. Section 12. The meta theory why some of these are real? There is one more thing to consider before we close, and it is the thing that makes the Cypress Hill story more interesting than all the others. The standard explanation for Simpsons predictions is volume plus intelligence plus confirmation bias. Lots of predictions, smart writers, we remember the ones that came true. This explanation is correct as far as it goes. It explains most of what we have discussed tonight, but it does not explain Cypress Hill. Because in the Cypress Hill case, the prediction did not just turn out to be accurate. The prediction caused the thing it depicted. Be Real acknowledged awareness of the episode. The collaboration happened in a cultural context where the Simpsons joke was known and was part of the cultural vocabulary around what Cypress Hill could be and do. The episode did not forecast a collaboration that was going to happen anyway. The episode put an idea into the world, and the idea became real because it had been put into the world. This is a different phenomenon from accurate prediction. This is cultural causation, and if it is true for the Cypress Hill collaboration, it is worth asking whether it might be true for other things the show has depicted. The question is this: how many of the things the show appears to have predicted were things that the show itself helped bring into being? How many of the futures it depicted became real because depicting them made them more conceivable, more culturally available, more normalized as possible futures? The Trump presidency example is interesting in this context. The show depicted Trump in the White House as an absurdist, satirical prediction of celebrity political culture's logical extreme. The prediction circulated. The premise became part of the cultural vocabulary. When Trump actually ran, the Simpsons episode was one of the cultural references that people reached for to process what was happening. In some small way, the existence of the joke, the fact that this specific future had already been depicted, laughed at, processed through satire, may have made the actual event feel more narratively coherent than it would have otherwise. There is a version of this argument that is too strong, that The Simpsons depicted Trump's presidency and therefore caused Trump's presidency. That is not what is being suggested here. The causes of Trump's election victory in 2016 are complex and have been extensively analyzed, and a Simpsons episode from 2000 is not among them in any meaningful sense. But there is a weaker and more credible version of the argument, that the Simpsons episode contributed, in some small and unmeasurable way, to the cultural normalization of the premise. That by depicting Trump in the White House as a comedic possibility rather than as something impossible or unthinkable, the show made the premise slightly more thinkable. And when something becomes slightly more thinkable, it becomes slightly more possible, because the human imagination is one of the constraints on what actually happens in the world. Ideas that have not been imagined cannot be enacted. Ideas that have been imagined, even in satirical form, even as jokes, enter the cultural vocabulary. They become part of the available repertoire of possible futures. And some small percentage of those imagined futures become real because they were imagined. This is not mystical. This is how culture works. Fiction shapes reality not by predicting it, but by expanding the set of things that feel imaginable. The Simpsons is one of the most widely consumed fictional texts in American history. Its capacity to expand the imaginable is correspondingly large. The show did not predict the future. The show participated in making it. And the Cypress Hill collaboration is the clearest, most confirmed, most undeniable example of the mechanism. The show put an idea into the world. The people who could make the idea real encountered the idea, and they made it real because they had encountered it. 28 years between the joke and the Royal Albert Hall. One acknowledgement from Be Real. One causal chain that is actually documented rather than merely speculated about. If that happened once, it probably happened other times, in ways we cannot trace as clearly. The show has been putting ideas into the world for 36 years. Some of those ideas became real. The ones we know became real because of the show are the ones where someone involved in making them real left a record of the connection. The ones where the record does not exist are invisible to us but may not be absent from the causal history of what actually happened. Springfield does not reflect America. America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years and we stared into it so long that we started to resemble what we saw. The nuclear power plant, the corrupt billionaire, the incompetent government, the population too distracted to notice how badly they are being exploited, the endless cycle of catastrophe and reset, the collective amnesia that lets the same mistakes happen over and over. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was headed. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first. And in writing it down, the show made it more visible, more thinkable, more available as a frame for understanding what was happening. And what you can see and name and think about, you can enact, for better or worse, in ways that things you cannot see and name and think about you cannot. The predictions are real. Some of them are coincidence. Some of them are intelligence. Some of them are the show, causing the very futures it appeared to only depict. The combination is what makes the phenomenon interesting, and the combination requires all three explanations to fully account for it. No single explanation, not chance, not smart writers, not cultural causation, is sufficient on its own. The Simpsons predicted things because smart writers read trends carefully, and some of the trends continued in the direction they read. The Simpsons appeared to predict things that it actually caused because it is a culturally powerful text, and culturally powerful texts shape reality. And The Simpsons appears to have predicted more than it actually did because we remember the hits and forget the misses, and the combination of volume and memory bias produces a highlight reel that looks like prophecy. All three things are true. Holding all three of them at once, without collapsing them into a single, simpler story, is what actually understanding the prediction phenomenon requires. Section 13. The Final Meditation. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. Long enough that the town has settled into something familiar again, not the casual familiarity of a show you have grown up with, but the specific familiarity of a place you have examined carefully and found stranger than you expected, more layered, more densely packed with things worth noticing. What we have found is this: a show that has been thinking about America for 36 years, staffed by smart and well-read people who took their observations seriously even when the format required them to make those observations funny, has produced a body of work that is accurate about its subject in ways that are difficult to fully account for. Some of the accuracy is statistical. Enough observations, enough of them will be right by chance. Some of it is analytical, smart people reading trends carefully and extrapolating with discipline. Some of it is causal, the show putting ideas into cultural circulation where they became available to become real. And some of it, the Higgs boson equation, the donut universe, a few specific visual details from a few specific episodes, sits in a category where the available explanations fit imperfectly, where you can construct the explanation and it is plausible, and you are still left with the faint sense that plausibility is doing more work than it usually has to do. The imperfect fit does not require a supernatural explanation. Imperfect fits are normal. Explanations are always imperfect. Reality is always more specific than any framework built to account for it. The universe is under no obligation to be neat about this. But the imperfect fit is worth sitting with, here in the quiet, before the night takes you somewhere else. A physicist wrote an equation on a cartoon chalkboard in the background of a comedy scene. The equation was real. The mathematics was real. The number it predicted was real. And 12 years later, a machine built under the Swiss and French countryside confirmed that the number was right. That is the show. That is Springfield. That is what 36 years of intelligent, sustained, careful observation of American life looks like when you add up all the episodes and count all the observations and find the ones that happen to be right. The Springfield nuclear plant has been leaking into the water supply since 1989. Nobody has fixed it. Homer is still at his workstation, head drifting toward the console as the afternoon gets long. Burns is still alive and glowing faintly somewhere in a house that is too large for one ancient man, his weekly treatment administered at the same time every week by the only person who knows exactly what it involves. Bart has been 10 years old for longer than most of his audience has been alive. Lisa is still playing her saxophone in the quiet of a bedroom in a house on Evergreen Terrace, in a town that does not appear on any map. Because appearing on a map would mean having a fixed location, and a fixed location would mean accountability, and accountability is not something Springfield has ever had to worry about. The loop keeps running. The couch gag plays. The family files in and takes their places on the couch, and the television is already on, and something is happening in Springfield that will be funny and strange and slightly more true than it has any right to be. Somewhere in a future episode, there is probably an observation that will turn out to be right, something that will look like prophecy in 15 or 20 years, something that will become a screenshot and a meme, and a moment of collective, uncanny recognition. The writers do not know which observation that will be. They are just trying to write the joke. They are trying to make the joke land. And some of them will land in the present, and some of them will land in a future that has not arrived yet. That is the mechanism. That is the explanation. It is not mystical. It is the predictable consequence of a very long show made by very smart people in a country that never stops being interesting and strange. The predictions will still be there in the morning, the ones that came true and the ones that haven't yet and the ones that will come true because the show put the idea into the world in the first place. The night is quiet. Springfield is exactly where you left it. Evergreen Terrace is peaceful in the dark. The plant's cooling towers exhale their slow breath against the sky. Let it all settle. Let the floating timeline float. Let Bart stay 10 and Lisa stay 8 and Homer stay at his workstation, dreaming in his particular way about donuts and bowling and the specific shape of the universe. The show will still be there. It always is. There is one more thing worth knowing about how the Simpsons writers approach their craft, because it has bearing on why the predictions have the texture they do, why they feel like observations rather than guesses, why the right ones tend to be right about specific things rather than vague gestures at general directions. The writing room had a practice that was unusual for a comedy show. They read, not just comedy, not just television. They read widely across the fields that the show was making jokes about. Writers who were going to write about Homer's job at the nuclear plant read about nuclear power. Writers who were going to write about Springfield's political corruption read about political corruption. Writers who were going to write about the music industry read about the music industry. This sounds obvious. It is not obvious. Most comedy writing does not require this level of research. Most comedy writing requires an accurate understanding of how things feel to people, which is a kind of intelligence, but not the same kind of intelligence as understanding how a nuclear power plant actually fails or how a gig labor market actually works. The Simpsons writers did both kinds of research. They understood how things felt to people they had to, for the comedy to work, and they also often understood how the underlying systems actually functioned. And it is the combination of those two things that makes the show's observations so often accurate. They were not just describing the emotional texture of a trend, they were describing the structural mechanics of it. And structural mechanics, observed clearly and described accurately, tend to remain true for longer than emotional texture does. The emotional texture of American life has changed enormously in 36 years. The structural mechanics, the relationship between wealth and accountability, between corporate power and democratic governance, between environmental contamination and regulatory response, between celebrity and political legitimacy have changed much less. The show's structural observations have aged better than its emotional ones, because structure is more durable than feeling. This is what a long-running show made by careful observers looks like in retrospect. It captures the structure of things, and the structure persists. And what felt like a satirical exaggeration in 1992 feels like straightforward description in 2025, not because things got worse, but because the structure was always there and the show was always describing it honestly. Springfield did not become a more accurate description of America over time. Springfield was always an accurate description of America. It just took a while for the rest of us to see it. There is a final category worth considering before we close entirely. The predictions that were wrong so far but that have not yet been definitively refuted. The futures that are still pending. The flying car is probably not coming in the form the show imagined, though urban air mobility vehicles are being developed and may eventually produce something that earns the name. The moon colony is probably coming at some point, though the timeline has been repeatedly revised, and the permanent settlement that the show depicted as a near-term reality may be a generation away. The AI companion is probably coming in some form, though whether the form it takes will resemble what the show imagined is genuinely uncertain. But there is one prediction in particular that deserves special attention in this category: the show's depiction of global environmental catastrophe. Across many episodes, Springfield experiences environmental disasters of various kinds. The water is contaminated, the air is fouled, the wildlife is mutated. The EPA eventually determines that the town is so toxic that it must be sealed under a dome to prevent its contamination from spreading to the rest of the country. These are played as satire, as comedic exaggeration, as jokes about Burns's indifference and Homer's incompetence and the town's collective denial. But the underlying environmental concern that industrial activity, inadequately regulated, produces contamination that accumulates over time and has effects that are difficult to reverse is not a satirical exaggeration. It is an accurate description of a real dynamic that is playing out at a global scale in ways that were already visible in the early 90s when these episodes were written. Climate change is the global version of Springfield's contamination. Not identical, the mechanisms are different, the geography is different, the politics are vastly more complex, but the structural dynamic is the same. Industrial activity produces a byproduct. The byproduct accumulates. The accumulation has effects. The people responsible for the industrial activity have incentives to minimize, deny, and delay response to those effects. The population is slow to fully grasp what is happening because the effects are diffuse and gradual, and the immediate costs of addressing them are visible, while the future costs of not addressing them are abstract. The institutions responsible for regulation are compromised by the economic interests they are supposed to regulate. The community that would bear the cost of change resists it. The billionaire at the top of the system ensures that his particular needs are met regardless of what happens to everyone else. Springfield's contamination story is not a prediction of climate change, but it is the same story told at a smaller scale, with the same characters in the same roles. And the planetary version of the story has been unfolding in the decades since the show began, depicting the Springfield version. This is perhaps the most important prediction on the list. Not the Higgs boson mass, which is precise and confirmed and genuinely strange. Not the Trump escalator, which is culturally resonant and politically consequential. But the sustained, structural depiction of what happens when an industrial system is not accountable to the people who bear its costs. That prediction has been playing out since 1989. It is still playing out now. It does not have an ending yet. Springfield is still in the dome, the cooling towers are still leaking, Homer is still at his workstation, Burns is still alive, and the water is still contaminated, and nobody in town is quite sure what to do about it, and the next episode will start fresh tomorrow as if none of it ever happened. That is the prediction that matters most. That is the one that is still coming true. The following sections revisit each prediction in the ranking with expanded context, additional historical detail, and a closer examination of the specific episodes involved. The goal is not repetition, but depth, to spend more time with each entry than the summary treatment above allowed, and to let the weight of the evidence accumulate at the pace it deserves. On self-checkout and the labor transfer, the self-checkout machine is worth more time than the initial treatment gave it, because the joke buried inside the prediction is one of the show's most accurate satirical observations about how American retail works. When self-checkout machines were introduced, they were marketed to customers as a convenience. Skip the line, go at your own pace, finish when you are ready. The framing placed the benefit with the customer. The customer was not doing work. The customer was being given freedom. The autonomy of controlling your own checkout experience was presented as a gift from the retailer, a sign that the retailer trusted you, valued your time, understood your preference for independence. What was not mentioned in the marketing is that the customer was also doing labor that previously paid a wage to a human being. The customer became an unpaid cashier. The convenience was real. The labor transfer was also real. Both things were true at the same time, and the marketing worked by making the labor transfer feel like a benefit rather than a service reduction. The Simpsons joke in 1996 captures this inversion. The comedy in the scene comes from Homer's frustration with the machine, the way it does not quite work, the way it requires patience and technical literacy that Homer does not reliably possess, the way the convenience is conditional on a set of competencies that the machine assumes the customer has. The joke is about the gap between what the technology promises and what it actually delivers to the person using it. That gap is now the subject of genuine policy debate. Multiple major retailers have significantly curtailed their self-checkout programs in recent years, citing theft rates, customer dissatisfaction, and the realization that the labor cost savings were not as large as initially projected because the machines required human oversight anyway. The Simpsons joke about Homer's frustrated incompetence with the machine turned out to be a preview of a real operational problem that retailers would spend a decade discovering. On robotic mowers and the domestic automation wave, the robotic lawnmower belongs in a larger context. The wave of domestic automation products that began arriving in the early 2000s and that have progressively colonized more of the tasks that once defined suburban homeownership. The lawn was always a particular symbol in the American suburban imagination. A well-maintained lawn was a social statement, a signal of pride and property, a demonstration of the time and effort you invested in your home and neighborhood. The labor of maintaining the lawn, pushing the mower, edging the borders, dealing with the clippings was part of the ritual meaning of homeownership. You maintained the lawn because you owned the house. The lawn was how you showed that you took ownership seriously. The robotic mower removes the labor from the ritual. The lawn can be maintained without the homeowner spending a Saturday afternoon behind a push mower. The grass gets cut. The ritual does not happen. What the show noticed, in depicting the robotic mower as a joke about the future, is that the domestication of automation would not just change what tasks people did, it would change what tasks meant. The labor of homeownership was part of homeownership's meaning. The robot takes the labor. The meaning goes somewhere else, or dissolves, or shifts into the act of purchasing and configuring the robot instead. That is a more interesting observation than the prediction of the technology itself. The show was not just saying, "One day robots will mow your lawn." It was gesturing at what the automation of domestic tasks would do to the cultural meanings those tasks carried. And the cultural meanings of suburban homeownership have in fact shifted in ways that are connected, however distantly, to the progressive automation of the tasks that used to be part of its ritual. On smart glasses and the wearable computing dilemma, the smart glasses prediction deserves more time, because the story of what actually happened with wearable computing after the show depicted it is itself more interesting than the prediction. Google Glass was a genuine attempt to bring heads-up display computing to the consumer market. It was developed by some of the best engineers in the technology industry. It was backed by enormous resources. It had the advantage of a public debut that generated intense and favorable media attention. And it failed, commercially and culturally, in a way that taught the technology industry something important about the relationship between technical capability and social acceptability. The problem with Google Glass was not that it did not work. It mostly worked. The problem was that people who wore it in public became socially problematic in ways that the people who built it had not fully anticipated. The glasses recorded video from the wearer's point of view. This meant that anyone near a glass wearer might be being recorded without their knowledge or consent. The fact that the device was visually obvious, you could tell when someone was wearing it, did not resolve the discomfort, because knowing that you might be being recorded and knowing with certainty that you are not being recorded are different things. Glass wearers were asked to leave restaurants, bars, and movie theaters. The term glasshole was coined to describe people who wore them insistently in contexts where others found them intrusive. The device became a symbol of a certain kind of technology enthusiasm that was indifferent to the social and ethical implications of the technology it was enthusiastic about. The show, in depicting smart glasses in 1995, depicted a character who wore them as a status object, something to be shown off, something that marked the wearer as being ahead of the curve. That framing turned out to be the accurate one. What the show did not depict is the social backlash that followed, because the backlash required the social context of widespread digital recording anxiety that did not fully exist in 1995. The prediction was right about the technology and right about the social dynamic of adoption. It was wrong about the social dynamic of reception. The people who wanted to wear smart glasses as status objects did not fully anticipate how the people around them would feel about being near someone wearing a recording device. The show depicted the wearer's perspective. It did not quite capture the perspective of everyone else in the room. On video calling and the collapse of distance, The video call deserves a moment of genuine reflection, because what it actually did to human experience is stranger than the show's prediction of it. The show depicted video calling as ordinary, as just a call, as something unremarkable, and that normalization has happened. But what has also happened, what the show did not quite predict, is what happens to distance when video calls become normal. Before video calls were common, distance was distance. When you moved away from people, you moved away from them. You could talk on the phone. You could exchange letters. But the physical reality of being far away was unambiguous, and the ways of maintaining connection across that distance were visibly inadequate to fully replace physical presence. Distance was real. Absence was real. The communications technology of the pre-video call era maintained connection without pretending to substitute for it. Video calls change this in a complicated way. They are much better at simulating presence than phone calls. They allow you to see the other person's face, to read their expressions, to feel something closer to what it feels like to be in the same room. And this is good, genuinely and unambiguously good, for maintaining relationships across distance. But it also blurred the line between being far away and being together in a way that has strange consequences. When a family member is a video call away, how absent are they? When work meetings happen on video calls, how much does physical proximity to your colleagues matter? When you can see your friends' faces from the other side of the country, is long-distance friendship significantly different from nearby friendship? The show depicted video calling as ordinary and unremarkable. What it did not predict is that the ordinariness of video calling would make the meaning of physical presence harder to articulate and easier to erode. When you can simulate presence cheaply and conveniently, the specific value of actual physical presence becomes harder to justify and harder to prioritize, and in some ways less available because the simulation has made the felt need for it less acute. The prediction was right. The specific social consequence was left unexplored. But that is the nature of good satire. It points in a direction and lets you find what is there. On autocorrect and the grammar of machine confidence. The autocorrect observation is more interesting than it first appears, because it is actually an observation about a specific feature of machine intelligence that remains unresolved 40 years after the Newton debacle. The machine's confidence. What makes autocorrect frustrating is not that it is wrong, it is that it is wrong with such certainty. The machine does not suggest a correction, it makes one. It decides. It produces the corrected output and presents it as what you meant, and if you are not paying close enough attention, the corrected output goes out into the world and the person receiving it is confused or offended or amused, and you have to explain that you did not write what you wrote, the machine wrote it, and you failed to catch the mistake in time. This is a specific and recurring failure mode of machine intelligence, the gap between confidence and accuracy. A system that said, "I am uncertain about this word, is this what you meant?" would be less useful and less disruptive than a system that says, "I know what you meant," and sometimes does not. The first system requires constant human attention. The second system mostly works and occasionally produces nonsense, and the damage from the occasional nonsense is worth the efficiency gain from the mostly working. The show understood this trade-off intuitively, because the Newton joke is specifically about a machine that is wrong without knowing it is wrong. The device does not malfunction in the way a broken tool malfunctions. It functions, it produces output, it completes the task it was designed to complete, but the output does not match what was intended. The machine's confidence is its failure. If it were less certain, it would be less efficient, but also less capable of producing the specific kind of embarrassing failure that the episode depicts. This remains the trade-off at the center of every autocorrect system, every language model, every predictive text interface. The machine is useful because it is confident. The machine is occasionally disastrous for the same reason. The show understood this in 1994, which is a long time before the language models that now operate at scale were anything more than academic research. On smartwatches as status signals. The Apple Watch analysis belongs in a longer conversation about how consumer technology became a component of identity performance in the 21st century. Before the smartphone era, the primary consumer technology product that functioned as a status signal was the car. Cars communicated information about their owners, income, taste, values, self-presentation, relationship to certain ideas about modernity and practicality and pleasure. The car was the thing you owned that other people saw and from which they drew inferences about you. The smartphone began to take on some of that status signal function in the 2010s. What phone you had, what brand it was, how new it was, what case it was in these communicated information. But phones are in your pocket most of the time, which limits their status signal function. They have to be taken out, displayed, used in public for the signal to transmit. The smartwatch solves this problem. It is on your wrist, it is visible whenever your hands are, it is always transmitting the status signal, and what the Apple Watch communicates is specifically not the function it performs, the health tracking, the notifications, the payment capability, but the relationship to Apple and what that relationship says about the wearer. It says, I am someone who buys Apple products. I am someone who keeps up with Apple products. I am someone for whom the cost of this device is not a significant obstacle to acquisition. The show anticipated this status signal function in 1995. It depicted a wristwatch that communicated membership in a certain class of technological adopter. The specific details were wrong. The device in the episode did not look like an Apple Watch. The social context was different. The specific things it communicated about its owner were different. But the underlying dynamic that a wrist-mounted computing device would function primarily as a status object whose symbolic meaning was as important as its practical utility was correct. That is the kind of observation that ages well because it is about human social behavior rather than about technology specifically. Technology changes. The human drive to communicate status through displayed objects does not change. The show was observing the human behavior and predicting that new technology would be recruited to serve it. That is a safer prediction than predicting what the technology would look like. On the death of physical media and the ownership question, the physical media prediction deserves more time because what actually happened to physical media raises a philosophical question that the show's gag did not quite get to, but that is worth sitting with. When you own a physical object, a CD, a DVD, a book, a record, you own it in a robust sense. You can play it or read it without an internet connection. You can loan it to a friend. You can sell it. It survives the end of the company that made it. It survives the cancellation of a streaming service. It persists in the world as a physical object that you have a legal claim to, and that will do what you want it to do as long as the physical medium holds. When you stream content, you do not own it. You have a license to access it for as long as the service continues to exist and as long as the terms of service do not change. You cannot loan it to a friend. You cannot sell it. If the service ends, the content becomes inaccessible to you. If the rights holder decides to remove it from the service, it disappears from your accessible library. You have purchased access, not ownership. The access is real and valuable and convenient. The ownership is not there. The show depicted physical media disappearing in favor of something more convenient and more immediate. What it did not quite capture is that the something more convenient also represents a fundamental change in what it means to have a cultural object in your life. The record was yours. The stream is licensed. The difference matters in ways that are still being worked through legally, philosophically, practically, and in terms of what it means for the preservation and accessibility of culture across time. What happens to films that exist only as streams when the streaming service loses the rights and the film becomes commercially inaccessible? What happens to music that lives only on a platform when the platform's terms change or when the platform fails? The physical object was robust to corporate failure in ways that the license is not. The show depicted the transition without getting to the question of what was lost in it. That question is now urgent enough to have its own academic literature. On the gig economy's hidden architecture, the gig economy prediction deserves one more pass because the specific episode context matters. In the episodes where Homer takes on task-based work, the humor comes from Homer's incompetence, his inability to understand the rules, to read the situation, to deliver the service reliably. The joke is at Homer's expense. He does not understand the new economy. He is not good at navigating it. He makes mistakes that cost him. But under the joke, the show is doing something more interesting. It is depicting a labor system in which the costs of failure fall entirely on the worker. Homer's mistakes are Homer's problem. The company, whoever is providing the platform for the transaction, is insulated from the consequences of Homer's failure because Homer is an independent contractor whose failures are legally his own. If Homer breaks something while on the job, Homer is liable. If Homer gets injured, Homer bears the cost. If Homer does a bad job and the customer is unhappy, the consequences for Homer are immediate and personal. His rating drops, His future work is jeopardized while the consequences for the platform are abstract and distributed. This is the architecture of the gig economy, and it is an architecture that was designed rather than emergent. The classification of gig workers as independent contractors rather than employees is not an accident or an oversight. It is a deliberate legal choice by companies that wanted to build a labor system with the economic benefits of employment without the legal obligations. The regulatory and legal debates about that classification, which have played out in California, in Europe, in courts and legislatures around the world, are debates about whether the design is legitimate. The show was depicting the design before the companies that would implement it at scale existed. On the recommendation algorithm and the narrowing self, the algorithm prediction has one more dimension worth exploring before we move on: the effect of recommendation algorithms on the self rather than just on information access. When a recommendation system learns your preferences and serves you more of what you have engaged with, it is doing something to your identity as well as to your information diet. It is learning who you are, or rather, who you are in terms of what you click on and watch and listen to, and then feeding that version of you back to you. The more you consume what the algorithm recommends, the more you confirm the algorithm's model of your preferences, and the more the algorithm's recommendations converge on a narrow and stable profile of you. Over time, the recommended content is not just matching your current preferences, it is shaping them. You are not just getting more of what you like. You are being trained to like more of what you already like, and to encounter less of what you might like if you encountered it, because the algorithm has no way to know that you would like something you have not already demonstrated engagement with. The show depicted Homer's delight at being known by the machine. The machine knows what Homer likes and gives him more of it. Homer is pleased. The implicit critique that the knowing is also a kind of limiting is left for the audience to draw, because Homer is too pleased to draw it himself. That is the right dramatization. Homer is the character through whom the show depicts the pleasures of comfort and familiarity without endorsing those pleasures as the only legitimate ones. Homer's contentment in the narrowing is real. The cost of the contentment is implied rather than stated. The viewer can see it even when Homer cannot. On corruption and the American shrug. The corruption prediction belongs in a longer history of how Americans have understood the relationship between their government and the people it is supposed to serve. In the early decades of The Simpsons' run, the late 80s and 90s, political corruption was still newsworthy in a way that implied it was exceptional. A corrupt politician was a scandal. A corrupt politician who was exposed and held accountable was evidence that the system was working. The exposure of wrongdoing was itself a sign of institutional health, because the institutions capable of exposing it were still functional. The show, in depicting corruption as normal and unremarkable, was ahead of the public mood on this. Springfield's residents do not find Mayor Quimby's corruption newsworthy because they have internalized it as a feature of the environment rather than a deviation from it. The corruption is the air they breathe. They may not like it, but they do not find it remarkable. By the 2010s, polling data on American trust in government was showing that this Springfield posture had become the American posture. Not that Americans had become comfortable with corruption, they remained consistently opposed to it in surveys, but that they had become less surprised by it, less outraged by specific instances of it, less willing to believe that exposure would lead to accountability. The outrage had been replaced by a cynical resignation that looked, from the outside, somewhat like the resignation of Springfield's residents. The show was ahead of the curve on this shift. It depicted the post-outrage relationship to institutional corruption before the American public had arrived at that relationship in fact. The satire turned out to be a preview rather than a distortion. On the celebrity pipeline and the skills transfer. The celebrity politician prediction is worth exploring through the question of what skills actually transfer from entertainment to governance. The conventional criticism of celebrity politicians is that the skills required to entertain an audience have nothing to do with the skills required to govern. This is partially true. The technical skills of acting or athletic performance or music do not transfer to policy analysis or administrative management or the negotiation of legislation. But there are skills that do transfer, and they are skills that are more important to modern political success than they might have been a century ago. The managed image. The ability to perform authentically in front of a camera. The construction of a personal narrative that feels genuine to a large and diverse audience. The capacity to remain appealing and relatable while operating in an environment that is inherently theatrical. These are skills that entertainers develop over years of professional training and practice, and they are skills that are highly valuable in the media-saturated environment of modern electoral politics. The show recognized this transfer intuitively. The celebrity politicians in Springfield are not depicted as inherently incompetent at politics. They are depicted as good at the performance of politics, which in Springfield and in America is most of what politics actually requires to succeed. The critique is not that celebrities are bad at their jobs. The critique is that the job has become one in which entertainment skills are disproportionately rewarded. That is a more sophisticated critique than the simple, celebrities should not be politicians argument, and it is the critique that the evidence supports. Most celebrity politicians have not been significantly worse at governance than the professional politicians they replaced. Some have been better, some have been much worse. But the average is roughly comparable, which suggests that the skills of entertainment and the skills of governance have more overlap in the modern political environment than the conventional critique assumes. On the misinformation vulnerability, the misinformation prediction deserves attention to the specific mechanism the show depicted, because the mechanism is more interesting than the general observation that people can be misled. In the Springfield episodes dealing with misinformation, the characteristic pattern is not that people are tricked by sophisticated deception. It is that people are tricked by messages that confirm what they already suspect, or fear, or want to be true. The misinformation works not because it is convincing on its own terms, but because it slots into existing belief structures in ways that feel like confirmation rather than manipulation. This is the psychological mechanism that researchers studying misinformation have identified as central to its effectiveness. The most dangerous misinformation is not the most elaborate lie. It is the story that resonates with existing fears, that confirms existing suspicions, that makes existing anxieties feel validated. The lie that works best is the lie that feels like finally hearing the truth. The show depicted this mechanism repeatedly and accurately. The Springfield population is not stupid, or at least not universally stupid, but they are vulnerable to information that confirms what they already believe, and that vulnerability is reliably exploited by people who understand it. This is not a fictional weakness of a fictional town. It is a documented feature of human cognition, extensively studied in psychology and behavioral economics, that makes all human populations vulnerable to strategic misinformation under the right conditions. The show was depicting something real about human psychology. The specific platforms and vectors that now exploit that psychology at scale were not available when most of these episodes were written. The vulnerability was there. The tools for exploiting it have been refined since. On Burns and the structural corruption of regulatory systems, the Burns predictions about essential service monopoly, about wealth and legal accountability, about the power that comes from owning infrastructure are most interesting when considered together rather than separately, because they all describe a single structural dynamic that has many applications. The dynamic is this: the entity that provides an essential service to a community acquires, through that provision, a structural leverage over the community that exists independently of any legal authority or democratic mandate. The community cannot easily withdraw its dependence on the service. The entity providing the service knows this. The entity uses this knowledge to extract rents, to resist regulation, to obtain favorable treatment from governments and institutions that have their own dependence on the entity's continued service provision. The leverage is structural rather than coercive. No threats need to be made, because everyone understands the consequences of disruption. This dynamic describes the relationship between utilities and the communities they serve. It describes the relationship between major employers and company towns. It describes the relationship between technology platforms and the businesses that depend on their infrastructure. It describes the relationship between financial institutions and the economies that require their continued functioning. In each case, the service provider has acquired structural leverage that political institutions are reluctant to challenge, because challenging it risks the disruption of the service. Burns is the archetype. He provides the electricity. Springfield cannot challenge him. Not because Springfield lacks the legal authority to regulate him, it does have that authority, in theory, but because the practical consequences of effective regulation might include disruption to the power supply, and no Springfield politician is willing to risk that disruption. The regulation is technically possible and practically impossible. The law applies and does not apply. The accountability exists formally and not substantively. This is an accurate description of how regulatory capture actually works in many real cases. The regulator is not bribed necessarily, though sometimes they are. The regulator is structurally compromised by the dependence of the regulated community on the continued operation of the regulated entity. The compromise does not require anyone to do anything corrupt. It operates through the structure of incentives. The show understood this and depicted it with a clarity that makes most academic literature on regulatory capture feel slightly slower than it should be. On the Disney-Fox merger as media consolidation thesis, the Disney-Fox merger prediction is best understood as a specific instance of a general thesis about media consolidation that the show has been making for its entire run. The thesis is this: the American media industry will continue to consolidate until a small number of very large entities control most of the content that most Americans consume. The drivers of this consolidation are not mysterious. Producing high-quality media is expensive. Distributing it globally requires infrastructure. The economics favor scale. Small companies that produce good content will be acquired by larger companies that have better distribution. Larger companies will be acquired by even larger ones that have even better distribution. The process has no natural stopping point except the limit of regulatory intervention, which has historically been insufficient to prevent the consolidation. The show made this thesis explicit in the 1998 episode by depicting a graphic showing Fox as a Disney subsidiary. The joke was the absurdity of the specific combination at that specific moment. The underlying prediction was the direction of media consolidation. The specific combination was not guaranteed by the thesis it could have been any large company acquiring Fox, but the thesis made the prediction plausible, and the plausibility meant the specific prediction was less outlandish than it seemed. The merger happened in 2019. The broader consolidation thesis has been confirmed repeatedly through the CBS-Viacom merger, through the AT&T Warner Media combination and its subsequent dissolution, through Discovery merging with Warner, through the ongoing consolidation of streaming services. The media landscape of 2025 is substantially more consolidated than the media landscape of 1998, and the trajectory is consistent with what the show was predicting. The Disney-Fox merger is one data point in a confirmed trend. On the GMO debate and the structure of technological controversy, the GMO observation is one of the show's most sophisticated because it identifies why scientific consensus fails to resolve certain public debates. The reason is not public ignorance of the science, though that plays a role. The deeper reason is that the debates are not actually about the science. When the GMO debate continues despite clear scientific consensus that the foods are safe, the persistence of the debate requires an explanation. The usual explanation that people are irrational, that they do not understand science, that the anti-GMO position is the product of ignorance or fear, is not wrong exactly, but it is insufficient. People who understand the science clearly and accept the safety findings can still have genuine concerns about GMO foods that the safety data does not address. Who controls the food supply? Genetically modified seeds are often patented, which means farmers cannot save and replant them from one year to the next, as farmers have always done. The intellectual property regime around GMO seeds concentrates power over a basic necessity of human life in the hands of a small number of large corporations. That is a genuine concern. It is not addressed by safety data. What are the ecological consequences of introducing modified organisms into ecosystems? What happens to wild relatives of modified crops when modified genes spread through pollen? What happens to non-target insects? The ecological questions are genuinely more uncertain than the safety questions, and they are legitimate questions that are not answered by demonstrating that modified food is safe to eat. These concerns are not irrational. They are substantive, and the debate has been conducted in a way that treats them as irrational as the product of scientific illiteracy or technophobia, rather than engaging with them as the legitimate concerns they are. The show, in depicting the debate as continuing despite the availability of scientific information, was accurately predicting that the scientific information would not resolve a debate that was not primarily about safety. That is a sophisticated observation about the limits of scientific authority in public debate. It does not require anti-science sentiment to be true. It requires only that not all legitimate concerns are safety concerns, which is both true and often ignored in debates about technology. On the surveillance state and what it means to be watched. The surveillance prediction deserves more time, because the Snowden revelations changed not just what we know about surveillance, but how we should understand what the surveillance means. Before Snowden, most Americans who thought about government surveillance assumed that it was targeted, that the NSA and its allies were collecting information about specific people who had given specific reasons for suspicion. The idea of mass surveillance, of programs that collected information about everyone regardless of suspicion, was the premise of conspiracy theories and dystopian fiction, not something most people believed was actually happening. After Snowden, the mass surveillance infrastructure was documented in specific detail. Programs that collected bulk metadata on phone calls, programs that collected internet communications, programs that accessed the servers of major technology companies, programs that monitored international communications flowing through undersea cables. The scale was larger than most people had imagined possible, and it had been built and operated for years without meaningful public awareness or democratic oversight. What does it mean to have been watched without knowing it? The surveillance did not change what people did, because people did not know about it. But the retrospective knowledge that you were watched, that your phone calls were logged, your internet activity recorded, your communications available to government analysts, changes something about how you understand your past. The private conversations you thought were private were not. The assumption of privacy that shaped what you said and how you said it was false. The show depicted surveillance as something the characters vaguely suspected but could not prove as a presence that might be there, that had effects even when it was not confirmed, because the mere possibility of being watched changes behavior. That is the actual mechanism through which surveillance exerts its influence. You do not need to know you are being watched for the watching to affect you. The mere knowledge that you could be watched is sufficient to produce behavioral change. The Simpsons depicted this effect before the specific surveillance infrastructure that would produce it at scale was fully built. On the Higgs boson, the physics behind the background detail, the Higgs boson prediction deserves a longer discussion of the physics involved, because understanding what the equation was doing makes it more rather than less impressive. The Higgs boson is the quantum of the Higgs field, which is the field responsible for giving certain fundamental particles their mass. The theoretical prediction of the Higgs boson's existence came from work by Peter Higgs and other physicists in the 1960s. The particle was incorporated into the Standard Model of Particle Physics, the theory that describes the fundamental particles and forces of the universe as a predicted but undetected component. The challenge of detecting the Higgs boson is that it is extremely massive by particle physics standards and extremely short-lived. It is produced only in high-energy particle collisions, and it decays almost immediately into other particles. Detecting it requires a collider powerful enough to produce enough energy to create it in large numbers, and a detector sensitive enough to identify its decay products among the enormous number of other particles produced in the same collisions. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN, which began operation in 2008 and collected the data that led to the Higgs discovery announcement in 2012, is 17 miles in circumference. It took decades to design and build, and its construction involved collaboration among thousands of physicists and engineers from dozens of countries. Its development cost approximately $10 billion. It is one of the most complex and expensive scientific instruments in human history. And in the background of a Simpsons episode from 2000, a physicist wrote an equation that predicted, approximately, what that $10 billion machine would find 12 years later. The equation was not guessing. It was not random. It was the work of a physicist applying the best theoretical understanding of the time to the question of the Higgs mass. The Standard Model constrained the Higgs mass to a range. Precision electroweak measurements narrowed that range further. The equation on the chalkboard was an educated theoretical estimate based on those constraints. But the estimate was right. The experimental result was within the range the equation predicted. The physicist who wrote the equation in the background of a cartoon about a safety inspector who eats donuts during meltdown warnings did real physics and got a result that the most powerful particle physics experiment in history confirmed. That is the most insane Simpsons prediction, not because it required magic or prophecy, because it required a physicist who took the background details of a cartoon seriously enough to write a real equation there, and because the equation was correct. On the Donut Universe, Homer's accidental cosmology. The Donut Universe prediction is strange for a different reason than the Higgs prediction, and the difference is worth exploring. The Higgs equation was intentional. A physicist wrote it. The physicist knew what it was, The physicist knew it was real physics in a fictional context. The joke was, what would Homer write on a chalkboard if Homer were smart enough to write physics? And the answer the physicist gave was, Homer would write real physics that happens to be correct. The donut universe was different. It was not written by a cosmologist. It was written by a comedy writer who thought, what is the most Homer-like shape for a universe? What would Homer, with his donut obsession, his love of round things, his tendency to map the world onto his immediate appetites, conclude about the shape of the universe? The donut. Homer would conclude the universe is a donut. The comedy writer was not doing cosmology, they were doing Homer. And Homer, in his particular way, arrived at a hypothesis that cosmologists in 2003 would identify as consistent with observational data. This is the version of the prediction phenomenon that is hardest to account for. The Higgs equation has an explanation. A physicist did physics. The donut universe does not quite have that explanation. A comedy writer was writing Homer, and Homer's donut-shaped universe hypothesis turned out not to be false. The universe might be a donut. It might not. Cosmologists are still working on it. But the fact that a comedy writer's instinct about what shape Homer would conclude the universe to be turned out to overlap with a hypothesis that professional cosmologists take seriously is strange in a way that the Higgs equation, for all its specificity, is not strange in the same way. The Higgs equation was right because a physicist was trying to be right. The donut universe is possibly right even though nobody was trying to be right about cosmology. They were trying to write Homer on reality television and what we are doing when we watch it. Reality television deserves a longer examination because the show's satire of it is not just about the format but about what the format does to viewers and what it says about viewers' relationship to other people's experiences. When you watch a reality television program, you are watching real people, or people performing some version of themselves that is real, in some sense, in situations that have been designed or shaped to produce drama and conflict and emotional response. The situations are artificial, but the people inside them are real, or real enough. Their reactions are real, their embarrassment is real, their joy is real, their humiliation is real. The viewer's relationship to these real reactions in these artificial situations is complicated in ways that the show picked up on early. There is pleasure in watching real people navigate difficult situations. There is also something that resembles voyeurism or condescension or the pleasure of watching someone else struggle with things that you are not struggling with right now. Reality television offers the viewer a position of safety and judgment. You watch people make mistakes, experience embarrassment, be placed in situations they cannot fully control, and you watch from a position in which you are not making those mistakes, not experiencing that embarrassment, not subject to those situations. This is a kind of pleasure. It is not an admirable pleasure, necessarily, but it is real and it is widely shared, and reality television has built an entire industry on providing it. The show was pointing at this dynamic before the industry existed to point at it directly. The joke was, look at how we treat the idea of watching real people in difficulties. Look at what that means about us. The show made the joke and moved on, because it was a television show and not a sustained meditation on media ethics. But the pointing was accurate. The academic literature on reality television that has developed since the early 2000s largely confirms what the show was gesturing at, that the format invites identification and judgment simultaneously, that the pleasure of watching is often inseparable from the pleasure of superiority, and that the staging of the situations shapes the viewer's interpretation in ways that make the reality of reality television more constructed than the label implies. The show said all of this in the form of a joke. The literature said all of this in the form of theory. The content is substantially the same. On the music industry collapse and the artist's dilemma, the music industry observation is accurate in its general direction, but deserves a longer treatment of the specific mechanism that produced the collapse. The music industry in the early 90s was structured around the sale of physical media, records, cassettes, CDs. The industry's revenue came primarily from the margin on the sale of physical objects. Artists received a portion of that margin as royalties, typically a small portion after the costs of recording and promotion had been recouped by the label. The system was exploitative in many respects, but it did produce significant income for artists who achieved significant commercial success. Digital distribution broke this model in two stages. The first stage was illegal file sharing, which began with Napster in 1999 and continued through the piracy decade. File sharing removed the physical object from the equation, and with it, much of the revenue. The industry's response was aggressive legal action against individual file sharers, which failed to stop the practice and generated enormous ill will, and eventual adaptation to legal digital downloads through services like iTunes. The second stage was streaming. Streaming replaced the sale of individual tracks where the revenue per transaction, though small, was real with the licensing of catalogs at rates so low that most artists receive fractions of cents per stream. The industry has recovered in revenue terms, partly through streaming and partly through other sources. The artists have not recovered proportionally. The economics of streaming concentrate revenue at the very top of the streaming charts, the artists with hundreds of millions of streams, and deliver essentially nothing to the artists who are commercially successful but not globally dominant. The show's observation, made in the late 90s, was that the relationship between musical success and financial success was being uncoupled. The observation was directionally correct. The specific mechanism of the uncoupling streaming royalties, platform economics, the disappearance of album sales, was not visible from the late 90s vantage point, but the direction was. The show saw the uncoupling happening and depicted it. The uncoupling became more complete than the show imagined it would. On Cypress Hill, the full story. The Cypress Hill collaboration is worth more time than the summary treatment gave it, because the full story is both more mundane and more interesting than the simplified version suggests. Homerpalooza, the episode in which the Simpsons attend a music festival, aired in May of 1996. The festival in the episode was a clear satire of Lollapalooza, the touring alternative music festival that dominated the mid-90s. Cypress Hill was a real band that had been commercially successful in the early 90s, and their inclusion in the episode reflected their status as a major act of that era. The joke about the London Symphony Orchestra has a specific setup. Cypress Hill, in the episode, asks that the London Symphony Orchestra be sent to them, apparently as a joke or a demand made without expectation that it would be taken seriously. The orchestra arrives. The comedy is in the absurdity of the combination, the hard hip-hop act and the most formal, classical ensemble, sharing a stage because someone took the request seriously. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The concert was titled Cypress Hill, 'Tis the Season, and it was a genuine artistic collaboration rather than a comedic event. The group had been working on bridging hip-hop and classical music in various ways for years, before the collaboration materialized. B-Real's acknowledgement of the Simpsons episode in interviews is important because it is the only case we have of direct confirmation that the show's depiction of an event preceded and contributed to the decision to make the event real. The confirmation does not prove that the collaboration would not have happened without the Simpsons episode. Perhaps it would have. Perhaps the artistic interests that drove it were present independently of the cultural artifact that put the idea into circulation. But B-Real's acknowledgement establishes that the people who made the collaboration happen were aware of the prior depiction, and the prior depiction was a reference point in the cultural space where the collaboration existed. That is enough to establish the possibility of cultural causation, even if the causation cannot be proven conclusively. The episode put an idea into the world. The people who had the power to make the idea real encountered the idea. They made it real. Whether they would have made it real without the episode is a counterfactual that cannot be tested. What can be said is that the episode and the collaboration are connected by a documented chain of cultural awareness, and that the Simpsons' depiction of the collaboration may have been one of the factors that made it imaginable as a real event rather than just a comedy premise. That is how culture works. Fiction makes things imaginable. Imagined things become possible. Possible things sometimes become real. The Cypress Hill collaboration is the clearest documented example of this chain in the Simpsons prediction canon. On the cashless society and the pandemic acceleration, the cashless society prediction deserves a longer treatment, because what the pandemic revealed about the cashless transition is more complex than the simple observation that it accelerated the trend. Before the pandemic, the movement toward cashless commerce was voluntary and gradual. Businesses could choose to accept cash or not. Consumers could choose to carry cash or not. The infrastructure for cashless transactions was expanding, but cash remained a viable alternative for most transactions in most places. The choice was real, even if it was becoming gradually less convenient. The pandemic changed this in some locations in a way that felt like the choice being removed. Some businesses stopped accepting cash during the early pandemic period, citing infection risk from the handling of physical currency. The science on this was ambiguous. Transmission, through surfaces, turned out to be less significant than initially feared, but the practice of cashless-only operations spread regardless. For people without bank accounts, without credit cards, without smartphones capable of running payment apps, the cashless transition during the pandemic was experienced not as a convenience but as exclusion. This is the dimension of the cashless prediction that the show did not explore, and that deserves attention. The cashless society is convenient for people with access to the banking and technology infrastructure that cashless transactions require. For people without that access, who include significant portions of the low-income population, the elderly, undocumented immigrants, and others, the cashless society is not a convenience but a barrier. The elimination of physical cash from transactions eliminates a payment mechanism that is accessible to everyone with physical cash, regardless of their relationship to the banking system. The show depicted the cashless society as a future convenience. The actual transition has been, in some contexts, an exclusion mechanism. Both things can be true. The cashless society is more convenient for most people and more excluding for some people, and the distribution of the convenience and the exclusion tends to track existing inequalities. On nuclear plant failure and Homer's real meaning. The nuclear plant failure prediction deserves a different kind of expansion. Not more technical detail about how plant failures propagate, but more attention to what Homer's role as safety inspector actually means as a prediction. The joke about Homer being the safety inspector at a nuclear power plant is one of the show's foundational conceits. Homer is spectacularly unqualified. Homer is cognitively impaired. Homer sleeps at his workstation. Homer makes decisions based on immediate appetite rather than careful analysis. Homer represents, in exaggerated form, the kind of human failure that safety systems are designed to compensate for. But the show also depicts a plant management that knows Homer is who he is and keeps him in the job anyway. Burns hires Homer back after the German investors fire him. The German investors fire Homer because they actually assess his qualifications and find them inadequate. Burns rehires Homer because Homer's inadequacy serves Burns's purposes. A competent safety This is the actual mechanism of many real industrial safety failures. The Challenger disaster was not caused by ignorant engineers who did not know the O-rings were dangerous. It was caused by institutional pressure that overrode the concerns that competent engineers were raising. The BP Deepwater Horizon disaster was not caused by incompetent platform workers. It was caused by a corporate culture that treated safety procedures as negotiable obstacles to production goals. The real safety failures in industrial contexts are rarely the result of not having smart enough people involved. They are the result of institutional arrangements that make it rational for smart people to suppress or ignore the information that their competence is producing. Homer is the satirical version of this institutional arrangement. He is the incompetent kept in place not because no one knows he is incompetent, but because his incompetence is useful. His incompetence ensures that the violations continue, which ensures that Burns avoids the cost of compliance, which ensures that the plant's profitability remains where Burns needs it to be. Homer's job security is not a product of his excellence. It is a product of the value his inadequacy provides to the institution that employs him. This is an accurate structural description of how real industrial safety failures occur. The human at the center of the failure is usually not there by accident. They are there because someone made a decision that their presence in that role was advantageous. The decision is usually economic. The consequences are usually borne by someone other than the person who made the decision. The show understood this and depicted it consistently across its run. Homer is not a joke about a stupid man. Homer is a joke about a system that requires a stupid man in a specific role and has arranged for one to be there. On the Flint water crisis and Springfield's contamination. The Flint water crisis connection is worth exploring through the specific legal and political mechanisms that allowed it to happen, because those mechanisms are the same ones that allow Springfield's contamination to continue. Flint's water crisis was not caused by incompetence in the sense of people not knowing what they were doing. The state officials who made the decision to switch Flint's water source were making an economic decision, a cost-cutting measure designed to reduce the city's budget deficit during a period of fiscal emergency. The decision was made by people with authority over the city's operations. The failure was in what happened after the problems became visible. Water testing showing elevated lead levels was available to state officials. Complaints from Flint residents about the water's smell, color, and effect on health were being made to state and local officials. The information was there. The response was not. The specific failure was institutional. The incentives facing state officials pointed toward minimizing, disputing, and delaying response to the evidence of contamination rather than acknowledging and addressing it. Acknowledging the contamination meant acknowledging the cost of fixing it. It meant acknowledging the cost of the harm already done. It meant political and legal accountability for the decision to switch the water source. The institutional incentives pointed toward not acknowledging these things, and the institutional incentives won. This is exactly the dynamic The Simpsons depicts in Springfield. The information about the contamination is available. The residents are affected. The responsible parties, Burns, the plant management, the regulators who have allowed the violations to continue, know what the contamination is doing. The incentives facing those responsible parties point toward not acknowledging the problem. The Springfield nuclear plant continues to operate with its 342 violations, not because nobody knows about them. It continues because the economic and political incentives facing the people who could fix them point toward not fixing them. The Flint water crisis is not a one-off event. It is an instance of a pattern. The Simpsons has been depicting that pattern for 36 years. The pattern keeps finding new applications. On Margin Chains, reading the episode slowly. Margin Chains is worth watching with deliberate attention because the speed of the episode's coincidences with COVID-19 is unusual even for a show that has gotten things right before. The episode opens with a product manufactured in Japan. The manufacturing process involves a worker who is ill. The illness is transmitted into the product during its preparation for shipping. The product arrives in Springfield and distributes the illness to the people who receive it. This origin story illness transmitted through shipping networks was not the confirmed mechanism of COVID-19's early spread, but it was one of the early hypotheses that circulated in the first weeks of the pandemic, when relatively little was known about how the virus was moving internationally. The episode depicted a mechanism that felt credible enough in the context of early pandemic anxiety to generate significant online commentary. The illness in the episode is called the Osaka flu. It is a respiratory illness. It spreads through the community rapidly, faster than the town's healthcare infrastructure can manage. Springfield's hospital is overwhelmed. There are more patients than beds. Healthcare workers are exhausted and overwhelmed. The town's response involves a chaotic combination of official guidance, unofficial remedies, and social conflict. The demand for a cure produces a scene in which a fraudulent remedy is marketed to desperate Springfield residents, a crowd of anxious people surrounding a truck that promises relief, only to receive a cargo of water that does nothing. The scene is a clear satire of snake oil medicine and the vulnerability of desperate populations to fraudulent cures. In 2020, that scene played on social media alongside news stories about hydroxychloroquine, bleach injection, and various other remedies promoted during the pandemic without scientific basis. The episode is 27 years old. Watching it during an actual pandemic that shared enough features with its fictional epidemic to produce disorientation is an unusual experience. The show was not predicting COVID-19. It was depicting the social and institutional experience of an epidemic with enough accuracy that the two events rhymed in real time. We have been through 50 predictions. We have explored the misses. We have spent time in the writer's room. We have examined the meta-theory of cultural causation. And we have arrived at a point where the accumulated weight of all of it suggests something about what Springfield actually is and what it has been doing for 36 years. Springfield is not a town. It is a lens. A specific kind of lens that a specific kind of person, intelligent, broadly educated, deeply skeptical, persistently funny uses to look at America and make what they see visible in a form that an audience can receive without immediately defending against it. Direct criticism is easy to dismiss. If someone tells you directly that corporate power in America is used to harm ordinary people for the benefit of the powerful, you can argue with that. You can question the evidence. You can dispute the framing. You can protect yourself from the discomfort of the claim by engaging with its argumentative structure. A joke is harder to dismiss. When Burns refuses to fix 342 safety violations that are poisoning the town he has spent decades enriching himself from, and when Homer, whose entire adult life has been spent laboring in that facility, cannot make the connection between his employer and his own damaged cognition, The joke lands before the argument can be raised. The comedy precedes the defense mechanism. By the time the audience has felt the joke, the observation has already been received. That is what Springfield is for. That is what the show has been doing for 36 years. It is making observations that would be defensible if stated directly, but that are received more easily because they arrive as comedy. The observation enters before the defense can be raised. The observation is in the audience before the audience decides whether to admit it. This is why the show's predictions feel like predictions even when they are really observations. The observation was made, in comic form, years or decades before the reality it was observing had fully materialized. The audience received the observation as a joke because the reality was still incomplete. When the reality completed, the joke retroactively looked like prophecy. The observation was always right. The reality just needed more time to catch up. Springfield is America seen through a lens that makes its structure visible. The structure was always there. The lens reveals it. The audience sees the structure revealed in the form of comedy, which is the form most hospitable to difficult truths. And when the structure they have seen in comic form manifests itself in reality in ways that are not funny, the recognition is disorienting because the joke was already processed, and the reality requires a different kind of processing. That is the experience of Simpsons predictions. Not magic, not prophecy, not time travel. The experience of a lens that makes real structures visible in advance of their most visible manifestations. Closing words. The quiet persistence of Springfield. And so we arrive at the end of this long journey through Springfield's relationship to the real world. 50 predictions. 12 years of Higgs boson anticipation in a background gag. 28 years between a comedy premise and a concert at the Royal Albert Hall. 16 years between a satirical joke and a presidential election. A pandemic depicted 27 years before the pandemic it resembled. An equation that predicted the mass of a particle that cost $10 billion to detect. The floating timeline. The reset button. The eternal present tense in which Bart is always 10, and Lisa is always 8, and Homer is always just arriving home from another bewildering day at the plant, the same day he has been having since December of 1989, a day that will apparently continue until the audience stops pressing play. There is something to be said, at the end of all this, about why the show's persistence matters beyond the specific predictions we have examined. The Simpsons exists in a relationship with America that has no precedent in the history of television. No other show has been the primary fictional lens through which a culture examined itself for this long. No other show has accumulated this many observations over this long a period and had the time to watch many of them resolve. No other show has been sufficiently trusted by its audience to remain the reference point it started as. The trust is earned, and it is fragile, and it is real. When a Simpsons episode says something about where America is heading, people take it seriously enough to check. Not because the show is always right, it is not always right, but because the show has been right enough, often enough, that the question is worth asking. That is a significant cultural position to occupy. Most television does not occupy it for 5 years, let alone 36. Springfield persists because it is useful. It is useful as a lens, as a reference point, as a shared cultural vocabulary for observations about American life that otherwise lack a common frame. When someone says that feels very Simpsons, they are not saying the thing is cartoonish or unrealistic. They are saying the thing has the character of an observation that the show might have made accurate about structure, satirical in framing, slightly more true than comfortable. That is a specific kind of usefulness, and the 36-year accumulation of it is something that did not exist before this show and has not been replicated by any show since. The show will end someday. Every show ends. When it does, the accumulated observations it has made will still be there in the archive, in the episodes, in the clips and the screenshots and the memes and the moments that have become part of the cultural vocabulary. The lens will still be available even when the show that built it is no longer in production. And when some future version of the world manifests something that Springfield depicted 30 or 40 or 50 years before, the recognition will still be possible. The episode will still exist. The observation will still be there. The loop will still be accessible. Springfield persists because some things about America persist. Because the structure of power and wealth and accountability and denial that the show has been mapping since 1989 has not changed enough to make the map obsolete. Because Homer is still at his workstation, and Burns is still refusing to fix the violations, and Bart is still 10 years old and the water is still contaminated. The loop keeps running. The couch gag plays. And somewhere in the archive, in the background of a scene from 20 years ago, an equation sits on a chalkboard. It is correct. Thurched on without fully examining them. There are cultural observations the show made that deserve more careful treatment than the ranked list format allowed. And there are connections between the show and the world that run deeper than individual episodes. This final section draws all of it together. In the second season of The Simpsons, an episode called 2 Cars in Every Garage and 3 Eyes on Every Fish introduces Blinky, a 3-eyed fish caught in the waters directly below the Springfield nuclear power plant's discharge pipe. Blinky becomes a political symbol in the episode Burns is running for governor, and the image of the mutant fish threatens to derail his campaign. Burns's handlers arrange for him to eat a Blinky at a dinner broadcast on local television, and Burns finds it repulsive but forces himself through the meal in an attempt to demonstrate that the fish is safe. Blinky has become one of the most iconic images from the show's entire run. The 3-eyed fish appears on merchandise, in references to the show in other media, in discussions of environmental satire, and in real-world environmental contexts where a piece of contaminated wildlife has been found near an industrial facility. But the prediction embedded in Blinky is not just about nuclear contamination producing mutant fish, though that is the surface-level joke. The deeper prediction is about how an industrialist in the modern era manages a public relations crisis created by documented environmental harm. Burns does not deny that Blinky is mutated. He cannot. The fish is visible. Its mutation is obvious. Instead, he tries to normalize the mutation, to reframe it as natural variation, rather than as evidence of harm, to take the threat of the image away by assimilating it into the acceptable. He eats the fish on television. He demonstrates that he is not afraid of the fish. He performs comfort with the thing that frightens everyone else. This is an accurate description of the standard corporate playbook for managing environmental harm. You do not deny the evidence. Denial has a limited lifespan when the evidence is visible. You reframe it. You dispute the causal inference. You suggest that the harm is natural, that it would have happened anyway, that it is within acceptable parameters, that the people raising concerns are alarmists. You perform confidence and comfort with the thing that the community finds alarming, and the performance of confidence is itself an argument that confidence is warranted. The show depicted this playbook in 1990. It has been deployed in real environmental controversies many times since, in arguments about fracking and groundwater, about chemical plant emissions and community health, about industrial agriculture and ecosystem contamination. The playbook Burns's handlers gave him is the playbook that real corporate communications teams use when the evidence of harm is too visible to dispute directly. Blinky is not just a mutant fish. Blinky is a diagram of how industrial pollution and its management actually work. Marge versus the monorail is one of the most beloved Simpsons episodes, and one that contains a specific prediction about civic infrastructure and the dynamics of public investment that has aged into painful accuracy. The premise: Springfield receives a large windfall of money following a legal settlement. The town holds a meeting to decide how to spend the money. Marge advocates for using it to fix the town's crumbling infrastructure, specifically Main Street, which is in visible disrepair. A charismatic stranger named Lyle Landley arrives and pitches the town on a different idea: a monorail. A modern, impressive, expensive monorail that will make Springfield a great city. The town is seduced. The monorail is approved. Landley takes the money and builds a shoddy system that nearly kills everyone on its inaugural run before Homer saves the day. The prediction embedded in this episode is about a specific and recurring pattern in American public finance: the tendency of civic leaders and populations to choose impressive, visible, symbol-laden investments over unglamorous maintenance of existing infrastructure, even when the maintenance is more urgent and the impressive investment is more likely to be grifted. American infrastructure has been deteriorating for decades. Bridges are aging, water systems are corroding, roads are crumbling. The investment required to maintain existing infrastructure is enormous and unglamorous. It produces no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, no headlines about a city's vision for the future, no attractive renderings of gleaming new structures. Maintaining the existing road produces the same road that was already there. Nobody takes a photo of a maintained water pipe. But when a city proposes a new light rail system or a new stadium, or a new conference center, or a new waterfront development, the investment is visible and exciting and politically rewarding. The ribbon cutting happens. The headlines about civic ambition are written. The city looks forward-looking rather than merely adequate. And the grift opportunity is larger, because large new projects are harder to cost control and easier to redirect than maintenance spending. The American Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, one of the largest infrastructure investments in American history, was necessary precisely because decades of preferring Lyle Lanley's monorails over Marge's Main Street repairs had left the underlying infrastructure in a condition requiring emergency attention. The show depicted this dynamic in 1993 in a comedic framework that nevertheless captures the economic and political psychology that drives the pattern with considerable accuracy. Lyle Lanley is not a one-off villain in the Simpsons universe. He is the archetype of a real category of person who has figured out how to profit from the gap between what communities want to invest in and what communities need to invest in. Bart Sells His Soul is an early seasons episode in which Bart, skeptical of the existence of souls, sells his soul to Milhouse for $5. The episode explores what happens to Bart in the absence of his soul, not in a supernatural sense, but in a psychological and social sense. He becomes slightly off. His jokes do not land. Animals do not respond to him. He finds himself unable to experience certain feelings that he had previously taken for granted. The episode is a meditation on intangible value, on the things that cannot be measured or priced but that turn out, when they are absent, to have been essential to the texture of experience. This is not the specific kind of prediction we have been examining in this list. It is more of an observation about human psychology that the show made with considerable depth and that has become more relevant as the economy has increasingly moved toward the pricing and trading of intangibles. The digital economy runs on intangibles: attention, data, reputation, network effects, brand value, algorithmic position. These are the assets that determine outcomes in the most consequential sectors of the modern economy. They are difficult to measure. They are difficult to price. They are easy to lose and often impossible to recover once lost. The companies that have figured out how to accumulate them are among the most valuable in human history. The episode of Bart selling his soul for $5 and then trying to buy it back at a price that has risen beyond what he can easily afford is a compressed and comedic version of the insight that intangibles have real value even when that value cannot be easily priced, and that trading them away for immediate tangible goods is a mistake whose cost becomes visible only after the trade has been made. Every user who has exchanged their data for the free use of a social media platform has made some version of this trade. The platform gets something of significant long-term value. The user gets the immediate convenience of a free service. The user often does not fully understand what they have given away until much later, if ever. The episode was not predicting the data economy specifically, but it was depicting the psychological and economic logic that the data economy exploits at scale. Homer's Enemy is an episode from 1997 in which a highly competent, hard-working, professionally serious man named Frank Grimes arrives at the nuclear plant, encounters Homer, and is progressively destroyed by the experience. Grimes has worked hard his entire life. He has overcome obstacles. He has earned every qualification he possesses through effort and sacrifice. And Homer, who has done none of these things, who is manifestly unqualified for his job, who succeeds through luck and the tolerance of his environment, is more rewarded, more comfortable, and more socially beloved than Grimes will ever be. Grimes breaks under the strain of this injustice and dies trying to prove his point. The episode is one of the most deliberately uncomfortable things the show has produced, and it was controversial among viewers who found it too dark and too honest to be purely comedic. The prediction embedded in it is about meritocracy specifically, about the gap between the meritocratic narrative Americans tell themselves about success and the actual mechanisms by which success is distributed. The meritocratic narrative says, work hard, develop skills, earn qualifications, and success will follow. The American labor market says, this is partially true. Hard work and genuine skill and relevant qualifications are real advantages, but they are not sufficient, and they are not even necessary for all forms of success. Being in the right place at the right time, being liked by the right people, inheriting certain advantages, benefiting from certain accidents, these things also matter enormously. And the people who succeed through these mechanisms often occupy positions that the people who succeed through merit are also competing for. Grimes's outrage at Homer is the outrage of someone who believed in the meritocratic narrative and then encountered a reality that does not conform to it. Homer has the job without the qualifications. Homer has the success without the work. Homer has the comfort without the sacrifice. And the world treats this as fine, as acceptable, as normal, as nothing worth being upset about. Only Grimes finds it intolerable. And Grimes is destroyed by finding it intolerable. The meritocracy critique has become more prominent in public discourse in the decades since the episode aired, as evidence has accumulated that social mobility in the United States is lower than the meritocratic narrative predicts, and that the distribution of success in many sectors of the economy has more to do with inherited advantage and network position than with demonstrated competence. The episode depicted this reality in a way that was genuinely uncomfortable and genuinely prescient, and it was right enough that returning to it now feels less like dark comedy and more like painful realism. Across many episodes, Lisa is the character who sees the environmental crisis most clearly and who finds herself unable to communicate the urgency of what she sees to the adults around her. She organizes, she protests, she presents evidence, she argues, and the world continues more or less as it was, with some small improvements but without the fundamental changes her analysis says are necessary. This is not a prediction of any specific event. It is a depiction of a dynamic that has become one of the defining dynamics of the climate era. The gap between what the scientific consensus says is necessary and what political systems are capable of producing, experienced from the perspective of the person who understands the science and cannot make the system respond appropriately. The climate youth movement, Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, the Sunrise Movement has produced exactly the dynamic the show depicted. Young people who understand the science, who experience the urgency of the timeline, who are confronting the adults responsible for the decisions that have produced the crisis and will determine whether the crisis can be adequately addressed. The political response has been partial and insufficient, measured against what the science says is necessary, even as it has been real and not nothing, measured against what was achievable within the constraints of existing systems. Lisa's frustration is recognizable. It is the frustration of everyone who has read the science carefully and then watched the political process respond with a fraction of what the science says is necessary. The show has been depicting this frustration and the mechanism that produces it for 36 years, through a character whose fundamental characteristic is that she sees clearly in an environment that discourages clear seeing. Lisa is not a prediction. Lisa is a document of an ongoing experience. The experience has become more urgent and more widely shared in the decades since the show began depicting it. The show was right about the shape of it. Springfield's relationship with Shelbyville, the neighboring town, is a recurring comedic premise in the show that contains a serious observation about in-group and out-group psychology. The towns are similar. They have the same problems, the same people, roughly the same culture and history. Their rivalry is largely without basis. There is no genuine difference between them that would justify the hostility each town feels toward the other. The hostility exists because it exists, because it has been maintained through tradition, and because maintaining it serves a social function. It gives each town a sense of identity through contrast with the other. This is the fundamental mechanism of tribalism. Groups define themselves partly in terms of who they are not. The contrast with the outgroup is necessary for the in-group identity to feel stable and meaningful. The outgroup does not need to be genuinely threatening or genuinely different. It needs to exist and to be designated as different and lesser for the psychological function to work. The polarization of American political identity in the decades since the show began has followed exactly this logic. The research on political tribalism shows that much of what drives partisan behavior in contemporary American politics is not disagreement about specific policies, though that is real, but identity differentiation. Democrats define themselves partly in terms of not being Republicans. Republicans define themselves partly in terms of not being Democrats. The policy positions follow the identity rather than the identity following the policy positions. You adopt the positions of your team, because the positions are part of what it means to be on the team, and being on the team is the primary value. Springfield versus Shelbyville is a joke about this psychology. The joke is that the rivalry is absurd. The observation is that absurd rivalries are real, and that they are maintained by social mechanisms that are stronger than the interests or the logic that should dissolve them. The observation has aged poorly in the sense that the dynamic it identified has gotten worse. It has aged well in the sense that it was right. Superintendent Chalmers is a recurring character in the Simpsons universe who serves as the administrative oversight layer above Principal Skinner at Springfield Elementary. His role is to check whether the school is meeting standards. His function is accountability. What the show does with Chalmers is depict the failure of that function with extraordinary consistency. Chalmers arrives. Chalmers sees the evidence of institutional failure, the inadequate food, the poor test scores, the structural problems with the building, the various disasters that have become routine. And Chalmers, each time, accepts the explanation that Skinner provides, usually an obviously implausible one, and declares that everything is fine. He does not investigate. He does not follow up. He certifies adequacy and departs. The joke is about the gap between the accountability function and its actual performance. Chalmers is the accountability. Chalmers does not work. The institution continues in its dysfunction because the accountability mechanism has been captured by the institution it is supposed to hold accountable. Chalmers is not corrupt, exactly. He is not being paid to look away. He simply cannot or will not do the thing his role requires, because doing it is difficult and uncomfortable, and because Skinner is skillful at offering plausible explanations that give Chalmers permission to accept what he wants to accept. This is the accountability failure in a specific and accurate form. The inspectors, the auditors, the regulators, the overseers who are supposed to ensure that institutions function as they should, they often do not work, not because they are corrupt, but because they are embedded in social relationships with the institutions they oversee that make genuine accountability difficult. The regulator who finds genuine problems creates conflict and work and awkwardness. The regulator who accepts the plausible explanation that everything is fine avoids conflict and work and awkwardness. In the absence of strong institutional and social incentives toward genuine accountability, the path of least resistance is to accept the explanation. The American institutions that have failed most visibly in recent decades, financial regulation before the 2008 crisis, food safety inspection in various contamination cases, pharmaceutical oversight in the opioid crisis, have all displayed the Chalmers dynamic. The oversight function existed. People were appointed to perform it. The performance of the function did not require genuine investigation because the institutions being overseen provided plausible explanations that were easier to accept than to challenge. The result was the appearance of oversight without the substance of it, and eventually the accumulation of unchecked problems to the point of crisis. The show has been depicting this dynamic since the early 90s, in the form of a recurring comedic premise about a superintendent who is convinced that Springfield Elementary is adequate. The premise is funny. The pattern is real. The show was right about the pattern. It is worth returning to the education of the Simpsons writers' room one more time because there is a specific aspect of it that has been under-examined in discussions of the prediction phenomenon. Many of the show's most prominent early writers, including Al Jean, Mike Rice, Jeff Martin, Conan O'Brien, and others, attended Harvard and worked on the Harvard Lampoon before moving to television writing. The Harvard Lampoon is a humor magazine, but it is also an institution that teaches its writers to take comedy seriously as an intellectual enterprise. Lampoon humor at its best is not just funny. It is smart about the things it is being funny about. The intellectual tradition that these writers brought to the show is the tradition of using comedy to make serious observations about serious things. The best satire is comedy that is doing intellectual work, that is advancing an argument, making an observation, revealing something about how the world functions that would be harder to communicate in a direct form. The show's writers were trained in this tradition and applied it consistently. This matters for the prediction phenomenon because the observations that turned out to be accurate were not random observations. They were observations that followed from careful analysis of how specific systems work and where specific systems are heading. The writers were not just making up plausible-sounding futures. They were reasoning about real mechanisms, economic, political, technological, social, and extrapolating their likely trajectories. The Harvard training is not magic. Many people receive elite educations and do not produce observations as consistently accurate as The Simpsons did. What matters is the combination. Elite education, combined with professional pressure to make observations funny, combined with a production schedule that required constant generation of new observations, combined with a format that allowed those observations to range across the full breadth of American life. The combination produced a writing room that was simultaneously rigorous and prolific, and the combination of rigor and prolificacy is what produced the volume of observations necessary for some of them to turn out to be right. But the rigor is essential. Volume alone does not produce accurate predictions. Prolific speculation that is not grounded in careful analysis of how things actually work will produce many observations and few accurate ones. The show's writers were prolific and careful, and the carefulness is what made the volume productive rather than just noise. There is one more pattern in the show's predictions that deserves attention before we close, and it is a geographic pattern. The crises that The Simpsons has depicted across its run are disproportionately located in the kinds of places that American popular culture and political attention have consistently undervalued. Small to mid-sized industrial cities, dependent on a single industry, whose economic vitality is tied to the decisions of a powerful employer who has no accountability to the community beyond what self-interest provides. Springfield has a nuclear plant. The plant is the economy. The plant owner does not live in Springfield in any meaningful sense. He lives in a mansion, set apart from the community, connected to it economically but not socially or politically. The plant's relationship to the community is extractive. The plant takes labor and produces electricity and extracts profit. What it leaves behind: the contamination, the economic dependence, the political compromise of local institutions, is the cost that the community bears. This is the geography of deindustrialization, of opioid crisis, of concentrated poverty, of municipal bankruptcy. It is the geography of Flint and Detroit and Pittsburgh in the 80s, and the Ohio Valley in the 90s, and rural Appalachia in the 2000s. It is the geography of places whose economic vitality was built around a single industry or employer, and whose decline followed that industry or employer's withdrawal. Springfield has not declined in the way these places declined, because Springfield's floating timeline freezes it in a permanent mid-century present, where the plant continues to operate and Homer continues to have his job. But the conditions that would, in a realistic timeline, produce exactly the kind of decline that has devastated real American communities of Springfield's type are all present in Springfield. The dependence on a single employer, the corruption of local institutions by that employer's influence, the environmental contamination that the community cannot afford to address because addressing it might anger the employer whose continued presence is the only thing keeping the community economically viable. The show has been depicting a community in precarious dependence on an indifferent employer for 36 years. In the real world, many communities in exactly this position have experienced the full consequences of that dependence. Springfield has been spared by the mechanics of a fictional universe. The conditions the show depicts are the conditions that, in the real world, produce the consequences the show's floating timeline declines to depict. This is perhaps the most painful aspect of the show's relationship to reality. The satire spares Springfield. The satire cannot spare the real places that share Springfield's conditions. We have discussed Homer as a vehicle for the show's observations, as the character through whose experiences the show depicts the pleasures and costs of comfort and complacency and contentment. But Homer deserves a final treatment that is more generous than the satirical frame usually allows. Homer is not stupid in the way that the show's comedy sometimes implies. He is differently intelligent. He is brilliant at the things he cares about: mechanical problem-solving in emergencies, improvised culinary creativity, the navigation of interpersonal conflict in ways that preserve relationships without requiring anyone to change, and he is deeply uninterested in the things he does not care about, including most of the technical requirements of his job and most of the social niceties of professional behavior. His cognitive style is holistic rather than analytic. He solves problems by feel rather than by systematic analysis. He is guided by intuition rather than by reasoning chains, and his intuition is often wrong in ways that cause disasters. But it is also occasionally right in ways that reasoning chains would not produce. The donut universe is the image of this. Homer does not reason his way to a toroidal universe. He does not have the cosmological training to do so. He does not know what a torus is in the mathematical sense. He looks at the universe and feels that it is shaped like a donut, because the donut is the form through which Homer understands roundness and completion, and the satisfying sense of something that loops back to itself. And it turns out that some cosmologists think he might be right, not because Homer's intuition is cosmologically sophisticated, but because the universe is complicated and human intuition sometimes, for reasons that are difficult to fully account for, converges on things that are true. This is why poets sometimes say things about physics that physicists later confirm. This is why folk medicine sometimes contains compounds that pharmaceutical research later validates. This is why a comedy writer trying to write a joke about Homer's donut obsession extending to his cosmology can arrive at a hypothesis that is not obviously wrong. The intuition is not always right. Homer's intuition is wrong far more often than it is right. But it is occasionally right for reasons that are not fully accessible to systematic analysis. And that occasional rightness, multiplied across a writing room of highly trained intelligence working at the intersection of comedy and observation for 36 years, produces something that looks like prophecy from the outside. That is the full explanation. That is the complete account. It is less mystical than some people want it to be, and it is more interesting than the pure coincidence explanation allows. The show is very smart. The show has run for a very long time. The show has made very many observations. Some of those observations were right. Some of the rightness is intelligence, some is volume, some is cultural causation, and some is the slight weirdness of human intuition occasionally converging on truth through paths that reasoning cannot quite map. All of it is here. All of it is in the 800 episodes. All of it is available. There is a specific scene in a specific episode that seems, tonight, like the right place to end. Homer is at his workstation. He has not been watching the console. He has been dreaming, or eating, or thinking about the specific texture of a glazed donut at a particular moment of the morning when the light comes through the break room window in a certain way, and the coffee is still hot, and the day has not yet produced anything. Catastrophic. The console behind him shows indicators that, if read carefully, would suggest something requiring attention. Homer does not read them carefully. Homer is somewhere else in his mind. The plant continues to operate. The cooling towers exhale. The river downstream continues to glow faintly. And somewhere in the background of the frame, barely visible, is a chalkboard. And on the chalkboard, barely legible, is an equation. And the equation is correct. Someone wrote it there, in the background of a comedy scene, because they were doing their job carefully, because they took seriously the obligation to put real things into fictional frames, because the background details matter even when nobody notices them. The equation will be noticed someday. It will be noticed 12 years from now, or 20, or 30. And when the thing it predicts is confirmed by the appropriate instrument, someone will go back and find the frame and the equation will be there, correct and quiet and unremarked upon, for all the years between its creation and its vindication. That is what the show has been doing, putting things into frames, writing equations in backgrounds, making observations in the form of jokes, letting the world catch up. Springfield waits. It has been waiting since December of 1989. It will continue to wait, patient in its floating timeline, preserved in its impossible amber present, until the world has caught up with everything it has observed. There is more to catch up with, there always is. The night is quiet, let it be quiet. The following entries did not fit cleanly into Th. King, but deserve documentation as part of the complete accounting of the show's relationship to the world it observed. In a 2013 episode, Bitcoin is explicitly mentioned by name on the show Bitcoins Fall from the Sky in an animation sequence, and the joke is about the currency's volatility and the peculiar excitement surrounding it. This is not a prediction in the sense of depicting something before it happened, because Bitcoin was already real by 2013. But the episode's treatment of it is worth noting because of what the show chose to emphasize about the cryptocurrency phenomenon. The joke is about the irrationality of the excitement, the way that the promise of something new and technologically impressive can generate speculative enthusiasm that is disconnected from any clear analysis of the underlying value being created. The cryptocurrency market in the decades since has provided extensive evidence for exactly the dynamic the show was satirizing. The extreme volatility, the speculative frenzy, the gap between the technical sophistication of the underlying technology and the rationality of market pricing, the cycles of enthusiasm and collapse, all of it is consistent with the show's satirical treatment of Bitcoin in 2013. The show was not predicting the specific trajectory of cryptocurrency markets. It was identifying the psychological dynamic that drives speculative bubbles applied to a specific and current example. The observation aged very well. The specific cryptocurrency landscape of 2025, with its multiple boom and bust cycles, its mix of genuine technological innovation and brazen fraud, Its passionate communities of true believers and its waves of speculative participants who lost significant sums is entirely consistent with the episode's tone. Lisa's Wedding, a Season 6 episode, depicts a future version of Springfield through the lens of Lisa visiting a fortune teller who shows her a vision of her adult life. The episode is set in 2010, which, at the time of airing in 1995, was 15 years away. The episode's depiction of 2010 includes several specific details: wristwatch communication devices, a world where video calling is routine, England having apparently changed in specific ways, and various other details about daily life that the show imagined would characterize the near future of 2010. Some of these details were accurate. Video calling was routine by 2010. Wristwatch communication devices were not yet routine by 2010, but they were in development. The general texture of daily life in Lisa's Wedding's future was not precisely wrong. It was off in some details and right in others, in ways that are interesting to examine. But the episode is worth more time for a different reason. It is one of the clearest examples of the show taking future predictions seriously as a creative enterprise, rather than just as a comedic vehicle. The writers thought carefully about what 2010 would actually look like, drawing on trends they could observe in 1995, and tried to produce a coherent vision rather than just a collection of disconnected jokes about the future. The care is visible in the episode's details, and the care is what makes the accuracy interesting. They were trying to be right. They got some things right and some things wrong, in the way that careful prediction usually does. Homer's Triple Bypass, a Season 4 episode, depicts Homer requiring expensive open-heart surgery that the family cannot easily afford. The episode engages specifically with the financial crisis that a major medical event creates for a working-class family. The bills, the incomprehensibility of the medical billing system, the dependence on insurance that may or may not cover what is needed, the terror of a medical event that is simultaneously a health crisis and an economic one. The American healthcare system has remained a site of ongoing crisis throughout the Simpsons run. The specific issues the episode raised, the cost of major procedures, the complexity of insurance coverage, the vulnerability of working-class families to financially catastrophic medical events have not been resolved. They have in some ways worsened. Medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States. The complexity of the medical billing system has increased rather than decreased. The gap between what families need medically and what they can afford financially has remained one of the most persistent and politically contentious features of American life. The episode did not predict any of this, in the sense of depicting something that had not yet happened. The American healthcare affordability crisis was already real in 1992, when the episode aired. What the episode did was depict the lived experience of that crisis, the specific combination of terror and financial panic and bureaucratic confusion that characterizes the experience of a serious medical event for a purdy, working-class American family with enough accuracy that it has remained recognizable throughout the decades since. This is a case where the show's prediction is really its documentation. The show documented a reality accurately enough that the documentation has remained relevant for 3 decades. That is its own kind of foresight, knowing which realities to document because they will remain realities, rather than assuming that the problems visible now will eventually be solved. In a 1993 episode involving the early internet specifically, a pre-web online community that resembles the BBS culture of that era, there is a character whose behavior anticipates what the internet would eventually call trolling. The character engages in deliberately provocative, bad-faith online communication, not to communicate information or build relationships, but to generate conflict and attention and emotional response from others. The character seems to take pleasure in the disruption rather than in any underlying purpose the disruption serves. The term troll, in the internet communication sense, was not in common use in 1993. The behavior it describes was present in the early BBS and Usenet communities, but it had not yet been named and categorized as a specific phenomenon with its own psychology and social dynamics. The show depicted the behavior before the behavior had been named. The depiction is specific enough that a viewer today would immediately recognize the character as a troll in the current sense. The character is disruptive, attention-seeking, bad faith, and immune to the social sanctions that would modify the behavior of someone who was participating in good faith. Internet trolling has become one of the major features of online political and cultural life. The specific psychology of it, the way that causing distress or conflict is itself the goal, The way that the troll is immune to normal social feedback because they are not seeking normal social goods has been extensively studied and documented. The show depicted this specific psychology and this specific behavioral pattern a full decade before the mainstream internet existed and before the term that describes it was in common use. Bart Simpson has exhibited behavioral patterns throughout the show's run that are consistent with what would eventually be diagnosed and treated as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, an inability to sustain attention on tasks that do not interest him, impulsive behavior, difficulty with institutional settings that require sustained quiet compliance, and occasional moments of intense focus when engaged with something that holds his interest. The diagnosis of ADHD in American children increased dramatically from the 1990s onward. The rate of ADHD diagnosis in American children was significantly lower when the show began than it is today. Whether this represents a genuine increase in the prevalence of the condition, or an increased recognition and diagnosis of a condition that was always present but previously unrecognized, or some combination, remains debated in the medical literature. What is not debated is that Bart's behavioral profile became increasingly recognizable as the ADHD conversation entered mainstream discourse. Parents of children with ADHD diagnoses recognized aspects of Bart in their children. The show had been depicting this behavioral profile, without using the clinical terminology, since 1989, and the show's depiction has the specific texture of the actual condition, the selective engagement, the impulsivity, the difficulty with institutional compliance, the occasional bursts of genuine capability when the conditions align rather than just the simplified, hyperactive child stereotype. Whether the show was predicting the ADHD epidemic or simply depicting a real behavioral profile that had always been present in some children is impossible to determine from this vantage point. But the specificity of Bart's depiction and the degree to which it has remained recognizable to parents and clinicians across the decades of the show's run suggests that the show was observing something real about a real variety of human cognitive style. Kent Brockman is the show's primary vehicle for its satire of broadcast journalism, and the character deserves more attention than the 24-hour news cycle entry gave him. Brockman is not stupid, exactly. He is skilled at what broadcast journalism actually rewards, the smooth delivery of information in a form that maintains the attention of a passive audience. He is presentable and authoritative and capable of modulating his emotional tone to match the emotional register that the story requires. Grave for bad news, cheerful for good news, outraged when outrage is the expected response. What Brockman lacks is any meaningful relationship to the truth of the things he reports. He reports what he is given to report. He reads what is placed in front of him. He performs the emotions that the format requires. Whether the information is accurate, whether the framing is honest, whether the emotional register is proportionate to the actual significance of the event, these are not considerations that appear to weigh on him. He is a delivery mechanism, not a journalist. This satirical portrait of local and cable television news was accurate in 1989 and has become more rather than less accurate as the decades have passed. The economic pressures on broadcast journalism have intensified in ways that make the Brockman model increasingly dominant. Cost-cutting has reduced newsroom staff, which reduces the capacity for original reporting, which increases dependence on press releases and prepackaged content, and the smooth performance of authority without the substance of it. The managed spectacle is more managed and less newsworthy than it was when Brockman was created. The show has been running Brockman as a character for 36 years. He has not evolved. He does not need to. The problem he depicts has not evolved either. It has deepened. Hank Scorpio, who appears in a single episode of the show, is one of the most beloved characters the show has ever produced, and he contains a specific observation about the relationship between charisma and evil that has become more relevant since his creation. Scorpio is a supervillain. He is planning world domination through frankly illegitimate means. He is genuinely dangerous and his goals are genuinely harmful, and he is also an excellent employer. He listens to his employees. He addresses their concerns. He is supportive and warm and encouraging in the way that the best employers are. He gives Homer a job that suits Homer's actual capabilities rather than his job title. He seems to genuinely care about the people around him in a way that most of the other powerful figures in the show do not. Homer has a wonderful time working for Hank Scorpio. Homer, in fact, has the best professional experience of his life working for a man who is in the process of taking over the world through criminal force. The observation embedded in this character is about the separability of personal virtue from systemic harm. Scorpio is a good boss. Scorpio is also a supervillain. These are not contradictory in the show's depiction, and they are not contradictory in reality. Real people whose organizations cause serious harm are sometimes, in their personal interactions, warm and supportive and genuinely caring. The pleasantness of the personal relationship does not change the character of the systemic harm. The good boss and the villain can be the same person. The 21st century has produced numerous examples of charismatic founders and executives whose organizations caused serious harm to employees, to consumers, to the environment, to democratic institutions, while the individuals at the center of those organizations were described by people who knew them personally as brilliant, warm, inspiring, and genuinely committed to their stated goals. The charisma did not redeem the harm. The harm was not prevented by the charisma. The show understood this and depicted it in a single brilliant episode. Disco Stew, the Springfield character who remains permanently devoted to a cultural moment that ended decades before the show's timeline, is a joke about nostalgia, about the way individuals attach to specific moments of cultural efflorescence and remain fixed there while the world moves on. But Disco Stew has also turned out to be a prediction, in a sense, of the nostalgia economy that has become dominant in American popular culture in the 21st century. The entertainment industry has recognized that nostalgia is an enormously effective commercial force that people will pay significant amounts of money to revisit, in updated or repackaged form, the cultural moments that defined their formative years. The endless parade of reboots, remakes, sequels, and anniversary editions that characterizes the contemporary entertainment landscape is a disco stew economy. The culture is full of disco stus, each convinced that the moment they loved is the moment worth preserving and revisiting forever. The show was not predicting this when it created Disco Stew. Disco Stew is a joke about one person's excessive nostalgia. But the character captured something real about the human relationship to cultural memory that has, as the nostalgic generations have gained economic power and become the primary audience for commercial entertainment, become a defining feature of the entertainment economy. The joke became an industry. Disco Stew became a business model. The show has made predictions about the future that turned out to be wrong, but it has also made observations about the present that turned out to be harmful. Apu Nahasapia Mapetalon, the owner of the Quick E-Mart, is the most discussed example, and he deserves treatment in the context of this accounting. Apu is a depiction of an immigrant small business owner that was, for the first decade and more of the show's run, largely unexamined in terms of its effects on the South Asian community in America. The character speaks with a heavy accent performed by a non-Indian actor. The character embodies a set of stereotypes: the convenience store owner, the hyper-educated but economically marginal immigrant, the excessively accommodating service worker that, however affectionately the show treated him within its own universe, contributed to a set of cultural associations that were experienced as harmful by many South Asian Americans. The documentary The Problem with Apu, released in 2017, brought this criticism to mainstream attention and prompted a significant public conversation. The show's response was widely criticized as dismissive. The issue has not been fully resolved, and Apu's role in recent seasons has been significantly reduced. The Apu situation is not a wrong prediction. It is a case where the show, for all its intelligence and care in other areas, reproduced without adequate examination a set of stereotypes that were already present in the culture. The prediction failure here is not about the future but about the present. The show did not foresee that depictions it treated as affectionate and harmless would be experienced by a community as harmful and reducing. The self-examination that should have preceded the depiction did not happen, and the consequences have been real for the community affected. This belongs in an honest accounting of the show's relationship to the world it depicts, because the accounting should not be only about the moments of prescience. It should also include the moments of failure. The show has not been consistently wise. It has been consistently smart in some areas and consistently careless in others. The prediction phenomenon should not obscure the carelessness. The show is still in production. Season 36 has aired. Season 37 has been announced. The writers are still writing. The observations are still being made. Some prediction or observation made in the most recent season will, years from now, turn out to have been accurate. We do not know which one. The writers do not know which one. The future will reveal it, in the way that the future always reveals which observations were right by arriving in the form of those observations. It is possible that an observation about artificial intelligence made in a recent episode will turn out, in a decade, to be accurate in a specific way that feels like prophecy. It is possible that an observation about genomics, or about political structure, or about some technology that is currently in development, will age into precision in the way that the iPad observation aged into the iPad. It is possible that something in the background of a recent episode, an equation, a book title, a visual gag contains information that we will not know how to read until the world has moved into a position where the information is legible. We are, right now, in the position of a person watching the 2000 episode with the tablet computer and finding it unremarkable. We are in the present moment of the show. We do not know which of the current episodes will look, in 15 years, like it was reaching forward through time. That is a strange thing to sit with. The predictions we can identify are the ones that have already been confirmed by events. The ones that have not yet been confirmed are invisible to us. They are present in the archive. They are waiting for the world to catch up to them. And we are walking around inside them, watching them without being able to read them yet, the same way Springfield's residents walk around inside the contamination they cannot quite see. If you have arrived here from the beginning, you have been in Springfield for a long time. You have heard 50 predictions ranked by how insane they are, with expanded context and additional detail on most of them. You have heard about the predictions that did not come true. You have heard about the writers who made the predictions without knowing they were making predictions. You have heard the meta theory about how the show causes some of the things it appears to predict. The experience, if it has worked as intended, should leave you with something that is not quite certainty and not quite mystery, something in the space between the two. An awareness that the world has been described in advance in places you did not expect to find descriptions of it, in a form you would not have predicted those descriptions would take. And an honest accounting of why that is not because of magic, not because of prophecy, but because of intelligence and volume and selection and cultural causation and the particular kind of rightness that comes from paying careful attention to real things for a very long time. The show is still there. Springfield is still there. The cooling towers are still exhaling. Homer is still at his workstation, and somewhere in a background frame, in an episode you have not watched yet, there is probably something that is going to be right in a way you cannot see yet. Sleep well. The predictions will wait. Good night from Springfield.